I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I've been studying wildlife behavior in the Appalachian region for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen every type of confusion the mountains could produce in people. Hikers who take wrong turns, campers who lose track of time, even experienced outdoorsmen who panic and make poor decisions. But what happened with Margaret Hollins in October of 2023 still keeps me awake some nights, staring at data that shouldn't exist. Margaret was what we call a regular, 64 years old, retired elementary school teacher from Beckley. And she'd been hiking these trails for over 20 years. She knew the mountain better than some of our seasonal staff. Every Tuesday and Friday, weather permitting, she'd park her blue Honda Civic at the Laurel Creek trailhead and walk the same route, a moderate 2-mile loop that took her about an hour and a half. She carried a day pack with water, snacks, and one of those older Garmin GPS units that she'd bought sometime in the early 2000s and refused to upgrade. On Tuesday, October 10th, Margaret's car was still in the parking lot when I finished my evening equipment check at 6:30. That wasn't unusual by itself. Sometimes she'd extend her walk or stop to identify plants, but something felt off. Her car had been there when I'd arrived that morning, which would have meant she'd been on the trail for over 9 hours. Margaret never stayed out past sunset, and she certainly never hiked in the dark. I called her emergency contact, her sister Linda, who confirmed that Margaret had left home around 8 that morning for her usual Tuesday walk. Linda wasn't worried yet. Margaret was stubborn and independent, but she asked me to keep an eye out. I walked the loop trail with a flashlight, calling Margaret's name, but found nothing. No response. No sign she'd ever been there. Wednesday morning, the car was still there. Now, I was concerned. I contacted Park Dispatch, and we initiated a search protocol. Margaret's GPS unit had a feature that stored tracking data, so if we found her, we'd at least know where she'd been. Our search team covered the entire loop 3 times and expanded into adjacent trails. We used thermal imaging, brought in a tracking dog, and had volunteers checking every switchback and creek crossing within a 5-mile radius. Thursday, still nothing. Friday, the same. Margaret's sister filed a missing person report with the county sheriff, and the local news ran a brief segment asking for information. I kept walking that loop trail every evening after work, hoping to spot something our organized searches had missed. The leaves were turning, and the October light filtered through the canopy in a way that made shadows seem deeper than they should have been. On Monday morning, October 16th, Margaret's car was gone. I assumed her sister had come to collect it, but when I called Linda, she was as confused as I was. Linda had a spare key, but she hadn't been to the park. She thought Margaret might have come home, but Margaret wasn't answering her phone, and Linda hadn't seen her. We drove to Margaret's house together. Her car was in the driveway, but Margaret wasn't inside. Linda used her key to check every room. Margaret's hiking boots were by the door, still dirty. Her day pack was on the kitchen counter, empty except for a few granola bar wrappers. Linda called the sheriff while I examined Margaret's GPS unit. The device was completely drained, unusual, since Margaret always charged it before her walks, and the battery typically lasted for days. When I connected it to my laptop to download the tracking data, I expected to see maybe an hour or 2 of recorded movement from the previous Tuesday, probably showing Margaret walking partway around the loop before the device died or she turned back. Instead, I found 7 days of continuous tracking data. According to the GPS, Margaret had been walking steadily from 8:15 a.m. on Tuesday, October 10th, until 4:47 p.m. on Monday, October 16th. The tracking showed her moving at a consistent pace of approximately 2.5 miles per hour for 168 hours straight. But here's what made no sense. The entire route was the same 2-mile loop, repeated over and over. The GPS had recorded Margaret walking that identical circuit 91 times. I stared at the data for 20 minutes, thinking there had to be a malfunction. GPS devices can glitch, record phantom movements, or loop old data when the battery is dying. But the tracking was too precise, too consistent. It showed Margaret stopping for exactly 3 minutes every 12 hours, at the exact same coordinates near the wooden bridge over Laurel Creek. Otherwise, constant movement, the same route, for a full week. The sheriff arrived while I was still trying to process what I was looking at. He listened to Linda's story and looked over the GPS data, but he seemed more concerned about Margaret's current whereabouts than the tracking anomaly. The working theory was that Margaret had become disoriented, possibly suffered some kind of medical episode, and had been wandering in the woods until she somehow made it back to her car. People with dementia or delirium sometimes exhibit repetitive behaviors. The GPS data was curious, but not evidence of anything criminal. We found Margaret 3 hours later. Linda had suggested checking the regional hospital, thinking Margaret might have been brought in and was unable to identify herself. Sure enough, Margaret Hollins had been admitted that morning around 9 a.m. A motorist had found her walking along Route 19, about 12 miles from the park, severely dehydrated and disoriented. She'd been treated with IV fluids and was being held for observation. When we saw her, Margaret looked like she'd aged months instead of a week. Her skin was pale and papery. Her hair seemed thinner, and she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. But she was alert and recognized both Linda and me immediately. The doctor said her blood work showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition, consistent with someone who'd been without adequate food and water for several days. The strangest part was Margaret's version of events. She remembered leaving home Tuesday morning for her regular walk. She remembered parking at the trailhead and checking her GPS, but according to Margaret, she'd only walked for about an hour before feeling dizzy and deciding to head back to her car. The next thing she remembered was a highway patrol officer helping her sit down on the shoulder of Route 19. To Margaret, no time had passed. She thought it was still Tuesday afternoon. When I showed her the GPS data, Margaret insisted there had to be a mistake. She'd never walked for 7 days straight. That was impossible. She'd never walked the same trail 91 times in a row. She'd certainly never spent a week in the woods without shelter or adequate supplies. But she couldn't explain the battery drain, the empty water bottles in her pack, or how she'd gotten 12 miles away from the park. The doctor suggested that Margaret might have experienced a fugue state, a dissociative condition where people can perform complex behaviors while having no memory of doing so. It can be triggered by stress, medical conditions, or medication interactions. Margaret's primary care physician agreed that was the most likely explanation, though Margaret wasn't on any medications and had no history of psychiatric issues. The case was closed as a medical emergency with a satisfactory outcome. Margaret recovered fully, returned to her normal routines, and continued hiking the same trails she'd always walked. But she never used the GPS again. She gave it to Linda, who brought it to me, saying she didn't want it in the house. I kept that GPS unit in my desk drawer for months, occasionally downloading the data to see if there were any patterns I'd missed. The tracking never varied. Same route, same pace, same 3-minute stops at the bridge. I sent the file to colleagues at other universities, thinking maybe someone who specialized in GPS technology could identify the malfunction. Everyone agreed the data was anomalous, but no one could explain how the device had recorded a full week of movement while maintaining such precise consistency. What bothers me isn't the technology failure devices malfunction all the time. It's the correlation with Margaret's physical condition. She really had been without food and water for days. Her weight loss, dehydration, and exhaustion were consistent with someone who'd been walking continuously for a week, but she had no memory of it, and no one had seen her on the trail during all those days we'd searched. I still hike that loop every few weeks, partly for my research, and partly because I keep hoping I'll notice something that explains what happened. The trail hasn't changed. It's still a pleasant, unremarkable walk through mixed hardwood forest, with good sight lines and clear markers. The bridge over Laurel Creek is solid and well-maintained. There's nothing unusual about the coordinates where Margaret's GPS recorded those 3-minute stops. But sometimes, when I reach that bridge, I find myself pausing for exactly 3 minutes. I don't plan to do it, I just realize I've been standing there, looking down at the water, and when I check my watch, It's always been 3 minutes. I tell myself it's because I'm thinking about Margaret, trying to understand what she experienced during those missing days. The truth is, I'm not sure I want to understand. Some questions don't have answers that make you feel better for asking them. Margaret is healthy and happy, hiking her favorite trails and living her life. Maybe that's enough. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries, filed away in desk drawers where they can't keep you awake at night, wondering what really happened during those 7 days that felt like an afternoon. But I still have that GPS unit, and sometimes, late at night, I wonder what it would record if I carried it on the same trail Margaret walked, during the same hours she walked it, and let myself stop for 3 minutes at that bridge over Laurel Creek. I wonder, but I don't think I'll ever be brave enough to find out. I'm Marcus. I've been working backcountry patrol in the Daniel Boone National Forest for 8 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of camping mishap you could imagine. People who pitch tents in flood zones, families who set up camp on game trails, city folks who don't understand how sound carries in the mountains. But what I found on Pinnacle Ridge in September of 2022 still makes me question things I thought I understood about how people behave in the wilderness. My patrol route covers about 40 square miles of backcountry camping areas, and I typically make my rounds every other day during peak season. It's mostly routine, checking permits, making sure campsites are properly maintained, helping lost hikers, and occasionally dealing with wildlife conflicts. The work suits me. I like the solitude, the predictability of the trails, and the fact that most problems have straightforward solutions. Thursday, September 15th, was a perfect late summer day. Clear skies, temperature in the low 70s, just enough breeze to keep the bugs manageable. I was making my usual circuit through the designated camping areas when I spotted a family at Site 17, about 2 miles up the Sheltowee Trace. It was a good spot-level ground near a reliable water source, with natural windbreaks and decent drainage. The family had set up properly. A large dome tent, camp chairs arranged around a fire ring, cooler positioned in the shade, and sleeping bags aired out on a tarp. There were 4 of them parents who looked to be in their 30s, and 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old. They were from Louisville, according to their permit, and this was their first backcountry camping experience. The father, David, was enthusiastic about everything. He asked me about local wildlife, the best hiking trails, and whether they needed to worry about bears. Standard questions from first-time campers. The mother, Jennifer, seemed more reserved, but friendly enough. The kids were excited and running around exploring the area near their campsite. I spent about 20 minutes with them, going over basic safety protocols and answering their questions. They had plenty of food and water, proper gear, and a reasonable understanding of leave no trace principles. Their camp was well organized and positioned correctly for the site. I noted their permit information in my logbook and told them I'd probably see them again when I made my next patrol on Saturday. Everything about that family was completely normal. Saturday morning, September 17th, I started my patrol route early, around 6:30. The weather had turned cooler overnight, with a heavy dew and some morning fog in the valleys. When I reached the area where Site 17 should have been, I found nothing. The campsite was empty. No tent, no gear, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The fire ring was cold and clear of ash. The ground showed no indication that a tent had been pitched or that people had been walking around for 2 days. My first thought was that the family had packed up and left early. That happens sometimes. People get uncomfortable sleeping outdoors, or someone gets homesick and they decide to cut their trip short. But their permit was good through Sunday, and David had seemed genuinely excited about staying the full weekend. Still, it wasn't unusual enough to be concerning. I was about to continue my patrol when I heard voices uphill from the original campsite. Kids laughing, adults talking in normal conversational tones. The sounds were coming from about 300 yards up the ridge, in an area that wasn't designated for camping. It's steeper terrain, rockier, with less reliable water access. Not where experienced campers would choose to relocate, and definitely not where first-timers would move their gear. I hiked up through the trees and found the Louisville family at what would have been Site 21, if Site 21 existed. But that area had never been developed for camping. It was just a small clearing in the forest, surrounded by mature oaks and maples, with a decent view down the valley, but no established fire ring or level tent pads. The family was still asleep. All four of them were in their tent, which was set up in exactly the same configuration as it had been at Site 17. Their camp chairs were arranged in the same pattern around a makeshift fire ring built from local stones. The cooler was in the same relative position, still in the shade. Their sleeping bags, clothesline, and camp gear were positioned identically to how they'd been organized 2 days earlier. Even the kids' toys and hiking boots were arranged the same way. It was like someone had taken a photograph of their original campsite and recreated it perfectly 300 yards uphill. I stood there for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The logical explanation was that the family had decided to move their camp for some reason. Maybe they'd had problems with water drainage, or noise from other campers, or they just wanted a change of scenery. People relocate their campsites sometimes. It's not common, but it happens. But moving a full family camping setup 300 yards uphill through dense forest would have been a significant undertaking. The tent alone was probably a 6-person model, bulky and awkward to carry when packed. The cooler looked like it could hold several days' worth of food and drinks. They would have had to make multiple trips, carrying everything up a steep, uneven slope with no clear path. And they would have had to do all of this without leaving any trace at their original site. The tent started rustling around 7:15, and I heard David's voice saying something to his wife about coffee. I didn't want to startle them. Waking up to find a ranger standing outside your tent can be unsettling, so I made some noise, walking through the underbrush, and called out a good morning greeting. David unzipped the tent door and smiled when he saw me. He looked exactly the same as he had 2 days earlier. Rested, cheerful, completely normal. "Morning, Ranger," he said. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I agreed that it was and asked how their first night had gone. David said they'd slept great. The kids had been excited about sleeping outdoors, but everyone had settled down after dark and slept through the night. No problems with wildlife, no issues with their gear, no complaints about the campsite. Then I asked why they'd decided to move their camp. David looked confused. He asked me what I meant by moving their camp. According to David, they'd set up in this exact spot when they arrived Thursday afternoon. This was where they'd always been. He had no memory of camping at Site 17. And when I described the lower campsite location, he insisted I must be thinking of someone else. Jennifer emerged from the tent while we were talking, and she had the same reaction. She remembered arriving Thursday, setting up their camp in this clearing, and spending a quiet evening around their fire. She was certain they'd never been anywhere else. When I mentioned the established campsite with the official fire ring and the level tent pad, she said they'd looked at that area when they first arrived, but decided they preferred the privacy and views of this higher location. The kids, when they woke up, had the same story. They remembered exploring this particular area, finding interesting rocks near these specific trees, and playing games in this exact clearing. 8-year-old Emma even pointed to a distinctive fallen log and said it was where she'd seen a squirrel the first day they arrived. I checked my patrol log to make sure I hadn't made a mistake. My notes clearly indicated the family had been camped at Site 17 on Thursday, September 15th. I'd recorded their permit number, their vehicle information, and my observations about their campsite setup. But according to their permit, they were authorized to camp at Site 21, which didn't exist as an official campsite. I spent the rest of my time with the family, trying to understand the discrepancy without making them feel like I was interrogating them. They were completely consistent in their recollection of events. They'd driven up from Louisville, found this clearing, and set up their camp exactly where I found them. They'd never moved their gear, never spent time at the lower site, never even considered relocating during their stay. The family seemed happy and relaxed. The kids were excited about hiking and exploring. David was still asking questions about local wildlife and trail conditions. Jennifer had warmed up and was more talkative than she'd been during our first meeting. There was nothing unusual about their behavior, their gear, or their campsite setup, except for the fact that it was in a location where it shouldn't have been possible. After I left them, I hiked back down to Site 17 and spent an hour examining the area where I was certain they'd been camped. The ground was undisturbed. There were no tent impressions, no scuffed areas where people had been walking, no signs that a fire had been built in the ring. The site looked exactly like it had never been used, but I knew what I'd seen. I remembered our conversation, David's enthusiasm, the kids running around that specific campsite. I remembered noting the family's efficient setup and thinking they'd done a good job choosing their spot. I filed my patrol report that day, but I didn't mention the discrepancy. What would I have written? That a family had somehow moved their entire campsite uphill overnight while they slept, with no memory of doing so and no physical evidence of their previous location? It sounded impossible even to me. The family completed their camping trip without any further incidents. I saw them packing up Sunday morning, and they seemed to have had a positive experience. David thanked me for my help and said they were already planning their next backcountry trip. The kids were excited about everything they'd seen and done. They loaded their gear into their vehicle and drove away, apparently unaware that anything unusual had happened. I've been back to both locations dozens of times since then. Site 17 remains an active, properly maintained campsite. The area where I found the family has reverted to undisturbed forest. There's no sign that anyone ever camped there. No evidence that a tent was ever pitched or a fire ever built. The distinctive fallen log that Emma pointed to is still there, but it's covered with moss and shows no signs of recent human activity. What bothers me isn't just the impossibility of moving that much gear without waking 4 people or leaving any trace. It's the absolute certainty in their memories. That family genuinely believed they'd camped in that clearing from the beginning of their trip. Their recollections were detailed, consistent, and completely incompatible with what I'd observed and documented. I still work the same patrol route, and I still check both locations regularly. Sometimes I find myself standing in that upper clearing, trying to picture how the campsite looked that Saturday morning. The tent positioned just so, the chairs arranged around the stone fire ring, the cooler in the shade of that particular tree. It all made perfect sense when I saw it, as if it belonged there naturally. But camps don't relocate themselves. Families don't move heavy gear uphill through dense forest while they're sleeping. And people don't develop false memories that are more detailed and consistent than their actual experiences. I keep thinking there has to be an explanation I haven't considered, some detail I missed or misremembered. But every time I review what happened, I come to the same impossible conclusion. That family was in 2 places during their camping trip, and they only remember being in one of them. The woods are full of things we don't fully understand, but they're usually things we can observe and document and eventually explain. This feels different. This feels like something that happened in the spaces between what we can see and what we can prove, leaving only questions that don't have comfortable answers. I'm Rita. I've been working trail maintenance for the Cherokee National Forest for 11 years, and I thought I knew every inch of the trail system in my sector. You learn the personality of each trail where washouts happen after heavy rain, which sections need regular brush clearing, where hikers consistently take wrong turns. But last March, while cleaning up storm damage on the old Copper Ridge Trail, I found something that made me question how well any of us really know these mountains. The winter of 2023 had been brutal. Ice storms in January, followed by heavy snow, then a warm snap that brought flooding. When the weather finally stabilized in early March, we had months of cleanup work ahead of us. Fallen trees across trails, washouts that had carved new channels through established paths, and debris piles that would take weeks to clear. The Copper Ridge Trail had taken a particularly hard hit. It's an older trail, not heavily used anymore, but it connects to several popular day hikes, so we need to keep it maintained. I was working alone that Tuesday, March 14th, using the chainsaw to clear a massive oak that had come down during the February ice storm. The tree had fallen across the trail at a spot where the path curves around a steep hillside, and its crown had caught in several smaller trees, creating a tangle of branches and debris that extended about 20 feet downhill from the trail. It was the kind of mess that looks overwhelming until you start cutting systematically, working from the top down. I'd been at it for about 3 hours when I noticed something odd in the debris pile. Most of what I was clearing was recent storm damage, fresh breaks, green wood, bark that still smelled like sap. But buried under the oak's crown, I spotted what looked like a piece of treated lumber, pressure-treated pine, the kind we use for trail bridges and retaining walls. It was weathered gray and had obviously been there for years, but it was cut square and showed clear signs of having been part of some kind of structure. That was unusual. The Copper Ridge Trail doesn't have any bridges or major trail improvements in that section. It's mostly just a dirt path that follows the natural contours of the ridge. I'd walked this trail dozens of times, and I'd never seen any evidence of significant construction work, but the lumber was definitely there. And it was definitely intentional, not just a random piece of wood that had washed down from somewhere else. I shut off the chainsaw and climbed down into the debris to take a closer look. What I found was the remains of what had once been a substantial trail improvement project. There were sections of treated lumber that had obviously been part of a retaining wall, cut to precise lengths and drilled for galvanized bolts. Some of the original hardware was still attached, corroded but intact. There were also pieces of what looked like a small bridge or elevated walkway, with notches cut for cross bracing and holes drilled for handrail posts. The construction was professional quality, not something a hiker or volunteer group would have built without authorization. But according to our trail maintenance records, no major construction had ever been approved or completed in this section of the Copper Ridge Trail. I'd reviewed the project history for this entire area when I first started working this sector, and there was no documentation of any improvements beyond basic maintenance and periodic rerouting. As I was examining the lumber, trying to figure out what kind of structure it had originally been part of, I noticed a plastic bag wedged under one of the larger pieces. The bag was the heavy-duty kind we use for carrying tools and supplies, and it had protected whatever was inside from decades of weather and decay. Inside the bag was a small notebook, the kind with a spiral binding and weather-resistant cover that field crews typically carry for recording daily work activities. The notebook was filled with detailed maintenance logs, written in careful handwriting with a blue ballpoint pen. Each entry was dated and included specific information about trail, work sections cleared, materials used, hours worked, weather conditions. Standard stuff, exactly the kind of documentation we're supposed to keep for all trail projects. But the dates in the notebook were from 1987, starting in early May and running through late September. According to the logs, someone had spent nearly 5 months working on extensive improvements to the Copper Ridge Trail. The entries described building retaining walls, constructing elevated walkways over wet areas, installing handrails on steep sections, and creating drainage systems to prevent erosion. The work was methodical and professional, with careful attention to materials, techniques, and long-term durability. Whoever had written these logs knew what they were doing, but there was no record of any such project being authorized or completed in 1987. I checked our archives when I got back to the office that evening, going through every work order, budget allocation, and project report from that year. The Copper Ridge Trail wasn't even mentioned in any official documentation from 1987. According to our records, it received only minimal maintenance that year, basic brush clearing, and a few minor repairs after storm damage. The handwriting in the notebook looked familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. We have dozens of current and former employees, and I'd seen a lot of different handwriting over the years on work orders, incident reports, and daily logs. But this particular style, neat, precise, with distinctive letter formations, seemed like something I should recognize. I showed the notebook to Tom Brennan, our sector supervisor, who's been with the Forest Service for over 30 years. Tom looked through the entries carefully, reading several pages before he went quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, he asked me where exactly I'd found the notebook. After I described the location, Tom went to his office and came back with a personnel file from 1987. The file belonged to Dennis Kowalski, a trail maintenance specialist who'd been hired in April of 1987. Dennis had been experienced, reliable, and well regarded by his supervisors. According to his employment records, he'd worked regularly through the summer and early fall, focusing primarily on trail maintenance in remote sections of the forest. His last recorded workday was September 23, 1987. He'd been scheduled for a routine trail inspection on September 24th, but he never reported for work and was never seen again. Dennis had left his vehicle in the parking area at the Copper Ridge trailhead. His tools and radio were found along the trail, about 2 miles from where his car was parked, arranged neatly beside the path as if he'd set them down to take a break. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened to him. The search and rescue operation continued for 2 weeks, but Dennis Kowalski was never found. Tom opened Dennis's personnel file and showed me samples of his handwriting from work orders and timesheets. The writing was identical to what I'd found in the notebook. Same letter formations, same precise style, same way of forming numbers and abbreviations. There was no question that Dennis had written those maintenance logs, but according to his official work assignments, Dennis had never been scheduled to work on the Copper Ridge Trail. His documented projects from 1987 were all in different areas of the forest, mostly day-use areas and popular hiking trails closer to developed facilities. The extensive construction work described in the notebook had never been authorized, never been budgeted, and apparently never been reported through official channels. Tom and I hiked back to the site the next day, bringing along Mike Santos from our engineering team. We wanted to understand what Dennis had actually built and why there was no remaining evidence of his work, except for the debris I'd found under the fallen tree. Mike examined the lumber pieces and confirmed that they showed evidence of having been part of substantial trail improvements, retaining walls, bridge structures, and drainage systems. Based on the notebook entries and the physical evidence, Dennis had apparently spent months building a series of trail improvements that would have significantly upgraded the Copper Ridge Trail. The work would have made the trail safer, more accessible, and more resistant to erosion and weather damage. It was exactly the kind of project that would normally be planned, budgeted, and documented through multiple levels of Forest Service bureaucracy. But none of that had happened. Dennis had apparently undertaken the entire project on his own, using materials and tools that weren't accounted for in any budget or inventory system. He'd worked alone, without supervision or official authorization, creating detailed logs of work that was never supposed to exist. The notebook entries stopped abruptly on September 22, 1987. The final entry described completing handrail installation on what Dennis called the North Approach section, and noted that the project was essentially finished pending final inspection. The next day, September 23rd, was Dennis's last official workday. September 24th was when he disappeared. We searched the area thoroughly, looking for any remaining evidence of Dennis's construction work. We found a few more pieces of treated lumber in the debris field, some corroded hardware, and what might have been concrete footings for bridge supports. But there was no intact structure, no clear indication of where the improvements had been located, and no obvious explanation for why they'd been completely destroyed or removed. The most unsettling part of the whole discovery was the quality of Dennis's documentation. The notebook entries weren't the rambling thoughts of someone who'd become confused or disoriented. They were professional, methodical, and detailed. Dennis had approached his unauthorized project with the same systematic attention that characterized all his official work. He'd recorded measurements, material specifications, and construction techniques with the precision of someone who expected his work to be reviewed and evaluated. But no one had known what he was doing. No one had authorized his project. And when he disappeared, No one had known to look for evidence of the extensive construction work he'd apparently completed. Tom decided to include the notebook in Dennis's case file, but he didn't reopen the missing person investigation. 36 years had passed, and there was no new evidence about what had actually happened to Dennis. The unauthorized trail work was puzzling, but it didn't change the basic facts of his disappearance. Tom's theory was that Dennis had been working on an unauthorized project, possibly planning to present it as a fait accompli to demonstrate his initiative and skill. When something happened to him, the improvements gradually deteriorated and were eventually destroyed by weather and natural processes. That explanation makes sense, but it doesn't account for the scale of what Dennis had apparently accomplished. According to his logs, he'd moved tons of materials, built substantial structures, and completed months of heavy construction work. All of that would have required equipment, supplies, and logistical support that should have been noticeable to other Forest Service personnel. Someone should have seen him working, or noticed materials being delivered, or wondered why he was spending so much time in a remote section of the forest. I've been back to that section of the Copper Ridge Trail dozens of times since I found Dennis's notebook, looking for any additional evidence of his work. The trail today is exactly what it was before. I found the debris, a simple dirt path that follows the natural contours of the ridge, with no significant improvements or construction. If Dennis really did build the extensive trail improvements described in his logs, they've been completely erased by 36 years of weather and natural processes. But I keep thinking about the quality of Dennis's documentation, the professional nature of his construction work, and the careful planning evident in his logs. This wasn't the project of someone who'd become confused or mentally unstable. This was the work of a skilled professional who had a clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish and the expertise to make it happen. What bothers me most is the possibility that Dennis succeeded. Maybe he really did build everything described in his notebook. Maybe the Copper Ridge Trail was once exactly what he envisioned: safer, more accessible, more durable. And maybe, for reasons we'll never understand, all evidence of his work disappeared along with Dennis himself, leaving only the notebook I found buried under storm debris as proof that any of it ever existed. Sometimes, when I'm working alone on the more remote trails, I wonder how many other unauthorized projects are hidden in these mountains. How many improvements that were never officially documented? How many structures that were built and then erased by time and weather? How many dedicated workers who left no trace except for careful notes that no one was supposed to find? Dennis's notebook is filed away now, officially part of his case record, but practically forgotten. The debris field has been cleared, the fallen tree removed, and the Copper Ridge Trail is back to its normal condition. But every time I walk that section, I find myself looking for signs of what Dennis built, trying to imagine how the trail looked when his work was complete, wondering if I would have noticed the improvements if I'd hiked there in 1987. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they let go of small pieces: notebooks preserved in plastic bags, lumber buried under debris, careful documentation of work that officially never happened. I suppose that's enough. We don't always need to understand everything we find. Sometimes it's sufficient to know that someone cared enough to do the work, even if no one was supposed to know about it. I'm Ranger Jim Holloway. I've been working wildlife management in the Monongahela National Forest for 14 years, and I thought I understood deer behavior about as well as anyone. White-tailed deer are predictable animals, alert, skittish, always ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They don't stand still when they know they're being watched, and they certainly don't maintain eye contact with humans. But what I observed during a routine population survey in November of 2022 changed how I think about the relationship between wildlife and the things that happen in these mountains. The annual deer count is standard procedure for wildlife management. We conduct population surveys twice a year to track herd health, monitor breeding success, and identify any environmental factors that might be affecting local wildlife. November is ideal timing. The leaves are down, visibility is good, and deer are active during daylight hours as they prepare for winter. I'd been assigned to survey a 12-square-mile section of the forest that includes Seneca Creek and the surrounding ridges. Tuesday, November 15th, was a perfect day for wildlife observation. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-40s, almost no wind. I'd started at dawn from the Seneca Creek trailhead and was working my way systematically through the survey area using binoculars to count and classify deer while maintaining enough distance to avoid disturbing their natural behavior. By 10:30 in the morning, I'd logged 17 individuals, a good population density for that area. I was positioned on a small ridge overlooking a meadow where deer frequently graze when I spotted her. A white-tailed doe, probably 3 or 4 years old, based on her size and bearing, standing at the edge of the tree line about 100 yards away. She was facing directly toward my position, which was unusual but not unheard of. Deer sometimes notice human observers despite our efforts to remain concealed. What struck me as odd was her posture. She wasn't displaying any of the typical alert behaviors I'd expect from a deer that had detected a potential threat. Her ears weren't forward or swiveling to track sounds. Her tail wasn't raised or twitching. She wasn't shifting her weight between her feet or turning her head to scan for danger. She was simply standing there, completely motionless, looking in my direction. I've observed thousands of deer over the years, and I've never seen one maintain that kind of stillness when they're aware of human presence. Even relaxed deer are constantly moving, chewing, shifting position, flicking their ears, adjusting their stance. Complete immobility is what you see in prey animals that are trying to avoid detection. But this doe was clearly aware of me and making no effort to hide. I focused my binoculars on her and started timing the encounter. The doe's eyes were fixed on my location with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. She wasn't looking past me or around me, scanning the area for threats. She was looking directly at me, maintaining steady eye contact across 100 yards of open meadow. After 10 minutes of this standoff, I began to feel genuinely unsettled. The doe hadn't moved at all, not her head, not her legs, not even her ears. She appeared to be breathing, but so slowly and shallowly that I couldn't detect any movement in her chest or flanks. Most unnervingly, I couldn't see her blinking. I was watching through 8-power binoculars with good clarity, and I should have been able to observe normal blinking behavior, but her eyes remained fixed and unblinking. I've studied enough animal behavior to know that sustained eye contact is extremely rare between deer and humans. Deer are prey animals with strong instincts to avoid direct confrontation with potential predators. When they detect human presence, they either flee immediately or freeze temporarily before fleeing. They don't engage in prolonged staring contests. 20 minutes into the encounter, I started documenting what I was observing. I noted the time, weather conditions, the doe's position, and her complete lack of movement. I took several photographs through my binoculars, though I doubted they would capture the full strangeness of her behavior. The doe remained motionless throughout my documentation, never shifting her gaze or adjusting her position. By the 30-minute mark, I was beginning to question whether I was observing normal wildlife behavior or something else entirely. The doe's absolute stillness was unlike anything in my professional experience. I'd seen deer freeze when startled, but never for more than a few seconds. I'd seen sick or injured deer that moved slowly or awkwardly, but this animal appeared healthy and alert despite her bizarre behavior. At 47 minutes, I decided to approach. Whatever was causing the doe's unusual behavior, I needed to understand it better, and observation from a distance wasn't providing answers. I stood up slowly, expecting the movement to trigger the doe's flight response. Instead, she continued staring at me with the same unblinking intensity. I walked down the ridge toward the meadow, making no effort to conceal myself or move quietly. The doe tracked my movement with her eyes but didn't turn her head or adjust her body position. As I got closer, 50 yards, then 30, then 20, I could see more details of her condition. Her coat was healthy and thick, appropriate for late fall. Her stance was balanced and normal, There were no obvious signs of injury or illness, but her eyes were what disturbed me most. Up close, they had an almost glassy quality, fixed and unblinking, with an intensity that seemed more conscious than I'd ever observed in wild deer. She was definitely aware of my presence, definitely tracking my movements, but showing none of the fear or flight instinct that should have been overwhelming at such close range. When I was about 15 feet away, the doe finally moved. Without any transition or preparation, she turned and walked away at a normal pace. Not the explosive flight response I'd expected, not the nervous, high-stepping gait of a deer under stress. Just a calm, measured walk into the tree line. As if she'd decided our encounter was finished, I followed her tracks into the forest, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because I wanted to understand what I'd just witnessed. The tracks were normal, the right size and depth for a deer of her apparent weight, showing a standard walking pattern. She'd moved through the trees at a steady pace, following what appeared to be an established deer trail. About 200 yards into the forest, the tracks led me to a small clearing where something had disturbed the ground. At first, I thought it might be a wallow or feeding area, but closer examination revealed something much more significant. The soil had been disturbed recently, and the pattern suggested deliberate excavation rather than natural animal activity. I called my supervisor to report what I'd found and request assistance. Within 2 hours, we had a full investigation team at the site, including detectives from the county sheriff's department and personnel from the state medical examiner's office. What we uncovered was a shallow grave containing human remains. The victim was identified as Patricia Vance, a 28-year-old hiker who'd been reported missing in August of 2022. Patricia had been hiking alone on the Seneca Creek Trail when she disappeared. Her car had been found at the trailhead, her backpack discovered about 3 miles up the trail. But despite extensive search efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups, Patricia herself had never been located. The search for Patricia had included 3 separate ground searches of the area where I found her remains. Teams of trained volunteers had walked grid patterns through that exact section of forest, using GPS coordinates to ensure complete coverage. Cadaver dogs had been brought in to search for any trace of human remains. The clearing where the doe led me had been within the search perimeter, and it had been examined multiple times by experienced searchers. Yet somehow, we'd missed the gravesite during all our previous efforts. The detectives estimated that Patricia had been buried shortly after her disappearance in August, meaning her remains had been there during our September, October, and early November search operations. The burial was shallow and would have been detectable by properly trained search dogs, but for reasons we couldn't explain, it had gone unnoticed. The investigation into Patricia's death revealed evidence of foul play, but I can't discuss the specific details due to the ongoing legal proceedings. What I can say is that her death wasn't accidental, and her burial in that remote location was clearly intended to conceal evidence of a crime. What continues to disturb me isn't just the tragedy of Patricia's death, but the inexplicable behavior of the doe that led me to discover her remains. I've researched deer behavior extensively since that day, consulted with wildlife biologists and animal behavior specialists, and I can't find any documented cases of wild deer exhibiting the kind of sustained, unblinking attention I observed. The official position is that my encounter with the doe was coincidental. Deer frequently travel through that area, and it's not unusual for wildlife to investigate or react to human remains in their territory. The doe's unusual behavior might have been caused by illness, injury, or environmental factors that weren't immediately obvious to me during our encounter. But that explanation doesn't account for the precision of what happened. The doe didn't just lead me into the general area where Patricia was buried. Her tracks led me directly to the gravesite, stopping within feet of where the remains were concealed. That level of accuracy seems beyond what you'd expect from coincidental animal behavior. I've returned to that meadow dozens of times since November, conducting both official wildlife surveys and personal observations. I've never seen the same doe again, never observed any deer exhibiting similar behavior, never found any logical explanation for what I witnessed. The area appears completely normal, typical white-tailed deer habitat, with standard animal behavior and movement pattern. The case against Patricia's killer is proceeding through the court system, and I'll testify about discovering her remains when the trial begins. But I don't plan to discuss the circumstances that led me to the gravesite. How do you explain to a jury that you found critical evidence because a deer stared at you for 47 minutes without blinking? How do you describe behavior that sounds impossible even to someone who witnessed it? Sometimes I wonder if there are things happening in these mountains that go beyond our understanding of normal wildlife behavior, patterns and connections that we can't see because we're not equipped to recognize them. The relationship between the animals that live here and the events that occur here might be more complex than we assume. But those thoughts tend to lead down paths I'm not sure I want to explore. It's easier to file away my encounter with the doe as an unexplained anomaly, focus on the positive outcome of finding Patricia's remains, and continue with the practical work of wildlife management. Most of the time, that approach works fine, except when I'm conducting population surveys in that same area and I find myself scanning the tree line for a white-tailed doe that might be watching me with unblinking eyes, waiting to show me something else I'm not supposed to know. Those days, I finish my work quickly and head back to areas where the deer behave like deer, and the only mysteries are the ones that have reasonable explanations. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes they choose to reveal them, using messengers we'd never expect and methods we can't understand. I suppose I should be grateful that Patricia's family finally has answers, even if I'll never understand how those answers were provided. Some questions don't need to be answered, as long as the important work gets done. I'm Dr. Maya Patel. I've been conducting acoustic research in the Olympic National Forest for 6 years, studying how sound travels through dense forest environments and documenting the impact of human activity on natural soundscapes. My work involves placing automated recording equipment at remote locations throughout the forest, collecting continuous audio data that I analyze for patterns, anomalies, and environmental changes. It's methodical, scientific work that rarely produces surprises until I reviewed the recordings from Station 7 in October of 2023. Station 7 is positioned on the Whole River Trail, about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. It's a popular backpacking route during summer months, but by October, the area sees much less foot traffic. The recording station itself is a weatherproof enclosure mounted 15 feet up a Douglas fir, containing digital recording equipment that operates continuously, powered by solar panels and backup batteries. The setup captures audio in a 360-degree radius, with enough sensitivity to detect normal conversation from several hundred yards away. I typically collect data from the remote stations monthly, downloading digital files and replacing memory cards during routine maintenance visits. The October data collection was scheduled for the 16th, following what had been a relatively quiet period in terms of human activity. Early fall usually produces recordings that are primarily natural sounds: wind, rain, wildlife calls, and the occasional aircraft passing overhead. Monday, October 16th, I hiked out to Station 7, expecting a routine data collection. The weather had been stable for weeks. The equipment was functioning normally according to its remote monitoring systems, and there had been no reports of unusual activity in that section of the forest. I downloaded approximately 700 hours of recorded audio spanning the previous month and returned to my laboratory to begin the analysis process. My standard procedure involves using audio analysis software to identify periods of human-generated sound, which I then review manually to classify the type of activity and assess any environmental impact. Most human sounds in the wilderness are predictable conversations between hikers, equipment noise from campsites, vehicles on distant roads. The software flags these sections automatically, allowing me to focus on the recordings that contain human voices or mechanical sound. On Wednesday, October 18th, while reviewing the flagged audio segments, I found something that immediately caught my attention. The software had identified a conversation recorded at 3:17 a.m. on October 15th. an unusual time for hikers to be active in that remote area. Most backpackers are asleep by midnight, and pre-dawn hiking in dense forest is uncommon due to safety concerns and navigation difficulties. The audio quality was excellent, suggesting the speakers had been relatively close to the recording station. I could hear two distinct voices, a man and a woman, engaged in what sounded like a normal conversation about trail conditions. They were discussing the difficulty of a particular section of the trail, comparing it to other hikes they'd completed, and planning their route for the following day. The conversation was detailed, relaxed, and completely ordinary. What struck me as odd was the content of their discussion. They were talking about specific trail markers, ridge conditions, and camping areas along the Hoh River Trail, with a level of detail that suggested extensive local knowledge. They mentioned landmarks by name, discussed recent changes to trail conditions, and referenced previous hiking experiences in the same area. This wasn't the conversation of casual visitors or inexperienced hikers. I made a note to follow up on the recording and continued with my analysis. The next day, October 19th, I received a call from the Olympic National Forest Emergency Dispatch. 2 backpackers had been reported overdue from a planned 3-day hike on the Hoh River Trail. Their vehicle had been found at the trailhead, and their emergency contact had confirmed they were supposed to return on October 16th. Search and rescue operations were being organized. The missing hikers were identified as David Chen and Rebecca Martinez, both experienced backpackers from Seattle. David was 32, a software engineer who had been hiking in the Olympics for over 10 years. Rebecca was 29, a nurse who had completed numerous challenging hikes throughout the Pacific Northwest. They were well prepared, carried appropriate safety equipment, and had filed a detailed hiking plan with the Park Service. I volunteered to provide any relevant acoustic data that might help with the search effort. My recording stations throughout the forest could potentially have captured sounds related to the missing hikers' calls for help, equipment noise, or conversations that might indicate their location or condition. I began reviewing all available recordings from the period when David and Rebecca were expected to be in the wilderness. That's when I realized the voices in the 3:17 a.m. conversation belonged to David and Rebecca. I'd never met them personally, but their emergency contact had provided voice samples from phone messages they'd left before beginning their hike. The speech patterns, vocal characteristics, and conversational style were unmistakably the same as what I'd recorded at Station 7. David's voice had a distinctive cadence, and Rebecca had a slight accent that was clearly identifiable in both the phone messages and the forest recording. But there was a problem with the timeline. According to the search and rescue coordinator, David and Rebecca had been found deceased on the morning of October 15th, approximately 12 hours before my equipment recorded their conversation. Their bodies had been discovered by other hikers around noon, about 5 miles from Station 7, in circumstances that suggested they had died during the previous night. I reviewed the recording multiple times, checking the timestamp and verifying the audio quality. The conversation had definitely been recorded at 3:17 a.m. on October 15th. The voices definitely belonged to David and Rebecca. And according to the official incident report, they had definitely been found dead 12 hours later, having died sometime during the night of October 14th. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated that David and Rebecca had died from exposure and hypothermia. They had apparently become disoriented during a sudden weather change, left the established trail, and were unable to find shelter or signal for help. Their deaths were classified as accidental, resulting from a combination of unexpected weather conditions and navigation errors in challenging terrain. But none of that explained how they could have been having a detailed conversation about trail conditions at 3:17 in the morning, 12 hours after they had died. I contacted the search and rescue coordinator to discuss the recording, thinking there might be an error in the timeline or identification. The coordinator confirmed that the bodies found on October 15th were definitely David and Rebecca, that they had been deceased for several hours when discovered, and that there was no possibility of mistaken identity. When I explained about the audio recording, The coordinator asked me to provide a copy for review. I compiled the relevant audio segment, along with technical documentation of my recording equipment and procedures, and submitted it as potential evidence related to the incident. 3 days later, the coordinator called to discuss my findings. The voice analysis had confirmed that the recorded conversation did appear to feature David and Rebecca's voices. The discussion of trail conditions was accurate and demonstrated detailed knowledge of the Hoh River Trail system. The recording quality was consistent with my equipment specifications, and there were no obvious signs of tampering or technical malfunction. However, the timing remained impossible to reconcile with the known facts of the case. The coordinator's theory was that my equipment had somehow recorded an earlier conversation and played it back with an incorrect timestamp, possibly due to a technical glitch or memory card error. While unusual, such malfunctions could potentially explain the discrepancy. I spent weeks testing my recording equipment, reviewing calibration logs, and examining every possible source of technical error. The Station 7 equipment was functioning normally. The internal clock was accurately synchronized, and the memory cards showed no signs of corruption or unusual activity. I found no evidence of any malfunction that could have caused a delayed playback or timestamp error. The official incident report made no mention of my audio recording. David and Rebecca's deaths were ruled accidental, and the case was closed without any reference to the impossible conversation I had captured. The search and rescue coordinator filed my recording as supplementary information, but it wasn't considered relevant to the final determination of events. I've continued my acoustic research in the Olympic National Forest, maintaining the same recording stations and following the same analytical procedures I've used for years. My equipment has never again captured conversations from deceased individuals, never again produced timeline discrepancies that challenge basic assumptions about cause and effect. But I've kept the original recording from Station 7, along with all the technical documentation and voice analysis results. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing audio data, I listen to David and Rebecca's conversation again. Their voices are clear and natural, discussing trail conditions with the enthusiasm of experienced hikers planning their next day's adventure. They sound healthy, alert, and completely alive. The conversation lasts 14 minutes and 37 seconds. They talk about the beauty of the forest, their appreciation for the wilderness experience, and their plans for future hiking trips. At the end of the recording, Rebecca laughs at something David says, and then their voices fade as they apparently move away from the recording station. The last words on the recording are David saying, "We should get some rest. Early start tomorrow." I've analyzed those 14 minutes hundreds of times, looking for anything that might explain how the conversation was possible. The audio shows no signs of editing or manipulation. The background sounds are consistent with the forest environment around Station 7. The conversation flows naturally, with normal pauses, interruptions, and overlapping speech patterns that would be difficult to fabricate. What disturbs me most isn't the technical impossibility of the recording. It's the content of the conversation itself. David and Rebecca sound happy. They're discussing their plans, sharing their love of the wilderness, looking forward to completing their hike. There's no indication of the disorientation, fear, or distress that must have characterized their final hours. In some ways, the recording feels like a gift, a chance to hear David and Rebecca as they wanted to be remembered, as enthusiastic hikers who found joy and meaning in the wilderness. But it's also a reminder that there are aspects of what happens in these forests that go beyond our ability to measure, document, or understand. I still conduct my acoustic research, still collect data from remote recording stations throughout the forest. But I've learned to accept that some of the sounds I capture might not fit comfortably into scientific frameworks or rational explanations. The wilderness keeps its own schedule, follows its own rules, and sometimes offers glimpses of events that exist outside our normal understanding of time and space. My equipment continues to record everything that happens within its range: the calls of nocturnal animals, the sound of wind through the trees, the conversations of hikers passing through the forest. Most of what I capture has straightforward explanations and fits neatly into my research parameters. But occasionally, I find recordings that remind me that the boundaries between what we know and what we can prove aren't as clear as we'd like to believe. David and Rebecca's conversation remains filed in my laboratory. A 14-minute audio segment that shouldn't exist but does. I suppose that's enough. Some mysteries don't need to be solved, as long as they remind us that there are still things in this world that exceed our understanding and that the people we lose in the wilderness sometimes find ways to let us know they're at peace. I'm Warden Tom Bradley. I've been working search and rescue operations in the Cascade Mountains for 19 years, and I thought I'd seen every type of confusion and disorientation the wilderness could produce in people. Hikers who lose the trail and panic. Experienced outdoorsmen who suffer heat exhaustion and make poor decisions. Even cases where altitude and dehydration cause temporary memory problems. But what I found in Martin Hendricks's camera in September of 2023 still makes me question what really happens to people during the hours they can't remember. Martin was a 61-year-old retired accountant from Portland who'd been day hiking alone in the Mount Hood National Forest. He was experienced, well-prepared, and familiar with the trail system. According to his hiking plan, filed with our office, he intended to complete an 8-mile loop on the Timberline Trail, starting and ending at the government camp trailhead. It was a moderate hike that should have taken him about 5 hours, and he'd completed the same route several times before without incident. When Martin failed to return by evening, his wife contacted our dispatch. We initiated a search that night, focusing on the Timberline Trail and adjacent areas where Martin might have taken a wrong turn or encountered difficulties. The weather had been clear and stable, visibility was good, and there were no obvious hazards that would have prevented an experienced hiker from completing his planned route. We found Martin the next morning, but not where we expected. Instead of being somewhere along the Timberline Trail system, he was discovered by a highway patrol officer walking along Highway 26, approximately 60 miles from where he'd started his hike. Martin was disoriented, dehydrated, and had no memory of how he'd gotten there or what had happened during the previous 24 hours. Martin's condition was concerning, but not immediately life-threatening. He was alert and responsive, able to provide his name and contact information, but completely unable to account for the time between starting his hike and being found on the highway. He remembered parking at government camp around 9 in the morning, checking his gear, and beginning the trail. His next clear memory was a highway patrol officer helping him sit down in the shade beside Highway 26. We transported Martin to the Regional Medical Center for evaluation, while continuing to search for his abandoned vehicle and any clues about what had happened during his missing day. His car was still in the government camp parking area, locked and undisturbed. His hiking pack was found about 2 miles up the Timberline Trail, sitting beside the path, as if he'd set it down to take a break. All his gear was present and accounted for water bottles, food, first aid kit, map, and compass. The one item we couldn't locate was Martin's camera. He'd told his wife he planned to take photographs during his hike, and she confirmed he'd brought his digital camera with him. It wasn't in his pack, not in his car, and not anywhere along the section of trail we'd searched. Since Martin had no memory of his experience, the camera potentially contained the only record of what had happened to him. 2 days later, a volunteer search team found Martin's camera about 12 miles from the Timberline Trail, in a completely different drainage system on the opposite side of Mount Hood. The camera was undamaged, sitting on a fallen log near a small creek, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. The memory card was still intact and contained 47 photographs, all taken during Martin's missing day. When I reviewed the images, I immediately noticed something strange about their composition and timing. The first 46 photographs were identical, the exact same image of a large Douglas fir tree, taken from the same angle and distance. The tree was distinctive, with a forked trunk and unusual bark pattern that made it easily recognizable. Each photograph was taken from what appeared to be the same position, with identical framing and lighting conditions. But what made the images truly unsettling was their timestamps. According to the camera's internal clock, the 46 identical photographs had been taken at precisely 10-minute intervals, starting at 11:47 a.m. and continuing until 5:47 p.m. That represented 6 hours of Martin standing in the exact same spot, taking the exact same photograph every 10 minutes for the entire afternoon. The final photograph, taken at 5:57 p.m., was different. It showed the same tree from the same angle, but the ground around the base of the tree was disturbed. The image clearly showed a circular pattern of boot prints in the soft earth, as if someone had walked repeatedly around the tree in a tight circle. The prints appeared fresh and were consistent with the hiking boots Martin had been wearing. I've investigated hundreds of search and rescue cases involving disoriented hikers, and I've never seen behavior patterns like what Martin's camera documented. People who become confused or lost in the wilderness might stop frequently to rest or assess their situation, but they don't typically remain motionless for hours while compulsively taking identical photographs. The level of repetitive behavior suggested by the images was unlike anything in my professional experience. The location where we found the camera was also puzzling. According to GPS coordinates embedded in the photographs, the tree Martin had been photographing was located in a remote area that wasn't accessible by any established trail. Reaching that location would have required several miles of off-trail hiking through dense forest and difficult terrain. It wasn't somewhere an experienced day hiker would typically venture, especially not as part of a planned loop hike on well-maintained trails. I hiked to the tree's location to examine the site firsthand. The area was exactly as shown in Martin's photographs, a small clearing dominated by the distinctive Douglas fir with the forked trunk. The ground around the tree base was soft and showed clear evidence of disturbance, consistent with someone having walked repeatedly in a circular pattern. The boot prints matched the tread pattern of Martin's hiking boots, but there was no indication of how Martin had reached that location or why he would have remained there for 6 hours. The surrounding forest was dense and difficult to navigate, with no obvious landmarks or attractions that would have drawn someone so far off the established trail system. The tree itself, while distinctive, wasn't particularly remarkable compared to thousands of similar Douglas firs throughout the forest. When I showed Martin the photographs, he had no recognition of the tree or any memory of taking the images. He examined each photograph carefully, studying the tree's distinctive features and the circular pattern of boot prints, but insisted he'd never seen the location before. According to Martin, he had no memory of leaving the timberline trail, no recollection of hiking through off-trail terrain, and no explanation for the compulsive photography behavior documented by his camera. Martin's medical evaluation found no evidence of serious injury, illness, or substance use that might have caused his memory loss and disorientation. His primary care physician suggested that stress, dehydration, or an undiagnosed medical condition might have triggered a dissociative episode, causing him to perform complex behaviors while having no conscious awareness of his actions. While unusual, such episodes can occur in otherwise healthy individuals under certain circumstances. The official incident report classified Martin's case as a successful rescue of a disoriented hiker who had experienced temporary memory loss due to unknown medical factors. The photographs were noted as evidence of his activities during the missing period, but no attempt was made to explain the repetitive behavior or determine how he'd traveled 60 miles from the location where the final photograph was taken. Martin recovered completely from his physical symptoms and returned to his normal activities within a few days. But he never hiked alone again, and he gave up photography entirely. When I spoke with him several months later, he said he couldn't look at images of trees without feeling anxious and disoriented. He donated his camera equipment to a local hiking club and had no plans to replace it. I've returned to the location where Martin's camera was found several times, both for official search training exercises and out of personal curiosity. The tree is still there, unchanged from how it appeared in Martin's photographs. The disturbed soil around its base has been smoothed by weather and time, but the tree itself remains a distinctive landmark in an otherwise unremarkable section of forest. What continues to disturb me about Martin's case isn't just the impossibility of his documented behavior, but the precision and consistency of what he apparently did during those 6 hours. The photographs show no variation in angle, distance, or composition. They were taken at exactly 10-minute intervals for 6 hours straight, suggesting a level of compulsive routine that goes beyond normal human behavior, even in people experiencing psychological distress. The circular pattern of boot prints around the tree base suggests that Martin spent considerable time walking repeatedly around the tree between taking photographs. But why would someone do that? What could have compelled him to remain in that location, performing the same actions over and over for an entire afternoon? And how did he travel 60 miles from that location to where he was found on the highway with no memory of the journey? I've consulted with psychologists, neurologists, and other search and rescue professionals about Martin's case, but none of the explanations I've received adequately account for all the documented evidence. Dissociative episodes can cause memory loss and repetitive behavior, but not typically with the precision and duration shown in Martin's photographs. Medical conditions can cause disorientation and confusion, but don't usually result in such methodical, purposeful actions. The case remains officially closed as a successful rescue with no ongoing safety concerns. Martin is healthy and has resumed most of his normal activities. His wife reports that he seems completely recovered from his experience, with no lasting physical or psychological effects. But she also mentioned that he occasionally stops talking mid-sentence and stares at trees when they're driving through forested areas, as if he's trying to remember something that stays just beyond his reach. I still carry a copy of Martin's final photograph in my search and rescue gear. It shows the tree with the disturbed ground around its base, the circular pattern of boot prints clearly visible in the soft earth. Sometimes, when I'm investigating cases involving missing or disoriented hikers, I look at that image and wonder what other repetitive, compulsive behaviors might be happening in remote areas of the forest, performed by people who will have no memory of their actions. The wilderness changes people in ways we don't always understand. Most of the changes are positive: increased confidence, appreciation for nature, a sense of accomplishment from completing challenging hikes. But sometimes the changes are harder to explain, involving hours or days that disappear from memory, leaving only fragments of evidence that something significant happened during the time that can't be remembered. Martin's camera captured 6 hours of impossible behavior in perfect detail, but it couldn't explain why those hours were necessary or what purpose they served. Maybe that's enough. Maybe some experiences are meant to be documented rather than understood, preserved as reminders that there are still aspects of human behavior and wilderness interaction that exceed our ability to categorize or explain. The tree is still there, in that remote clearing 12 miles from any established trail. I suppose it always will be, waiting for the next person who might find themselves compelled to photograph it repeatedly, walking in circles around its base, documenting something they'll never remember or understand. I'm Jenny. I've been working as a research assistant for the North Cascades Wildlife Research Station for 4 years, primarily studying black bear behavior and movement patterns. My job involves monitoring radio-collared bears through GPS tracking, analyzing their territorial ranges, and documenting any unusual behavioral changes that might indicate environmental stresses or human conflicts. It's systematic work that rarely produces surprises until I reviewed the tracking data for bear M47 in August of 2023. Bear M47 was a mature male black bear, approximately 400 pounds, that we'd been monitoring since 2021. He'd been collared as part of our long-term study on bear movement patterns in the North Cascades, and his behavior had been completely predictable for over 2 years. M47 maintained a consistent home range of about 15 square miles, followed seasonal patterns related to food availability, and showed typical avoidance behaviors around human activity areas. The bear's collar transmitted GPS coordinates every 4 hours, allowing us to track his movements with considerable precision. Over 26 months of data collection, M47 had never exhibited any unusual behaviors or movement patterns. He was, by all measures, a completely normal black bear, living a completely normal black bear life in the North Cascades ecosystem. That changed on August 13, 2023. I was conducting my weekly analysis of bear movement data when I noticed something odd about M47's recent GPS coordinates. Starting on August 13th, the bear had apparently begun following what appeared to be a hiking trail or established route, moving in a linear pattern that was completely different from his normal foraging and territorial behavior. Black bears don't typically follow human-made trails for extended distances. They usually cross trails or use them briefly as travel corridors, but they don't track along them for miles. The GPS coordinates showed M47 moving along what I initially thought might be the Pacific Crest Trail or one of the established hiking routes in his territory. But when I plotted his path on our topographic maps, I realized the bear wasn't following any known trail system. He was traveling cross-country through dense forest, maintaining a remarkably straight line, despite difficult terrain that should have forced him to detour around obstacles. Over 3 consecutive days, August 13th through August 15th, M47 had traveled approximately 18 miles following this unusual route. His GPS points showed him moving steadily northward at a pace that was consistent but slower than his normal travel speed. He made periodic stops, but instead of the random pattern you'd expect from a bear investigating food sources or resting, his stops occurred at regular intervals and lasted exactly the same duration. What made the behavior even more unusual was that M47 was traveling through areas where he'd never been recorded before. Part of his route took him well outside his established home range, into territory that our 2-year data set showed he'd consistently avoided. Black bears are creatures of habit with strong territorial instincts. They don't typically venture into unfamiliar areas without significant motivation. I was preparing to flag M47's unusual behavior for review by our research team when I received a call from the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. They were requesting any wildlife tracking data that might be relevant to a missing person case. Claire Dennison, a 26-year-old graduate student from Seattle, had disappeared while jogging on the Mountain Loop Highway on August 13th. Her car had been found at a trailhead, but despite extensive search efforts, no trace of Claire had been discovered. The sheriff's deputy provided me with the approximate coordinates where Claire's car had been located and asked if our collared bears had shown any unusual activity in that area. When I checked the location against M47's recent GPS data, I found something that made me immediately call back the sheriff's office. M47 had been located within 50 yards of Claire's car, at approximately the same time she was believed to have started her jog on August 13th. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of the correlation. When I overlaid M47's 3-day tracking route with the topographic maps and search grid coordinates, I realized that the bear had been following the exact path that search and rescue teams believed Claire had taken during her jog. Every GPS point from M47's collar corresponded to locations along Claire's presumed jogging route, traced with an accuracy that seemed impossible for coincidental animal movement. I provided the bear tracking data to the search and rescue coordinator, thinking it might help narrow their search efforts. If M47 had been following a scent trail left by Claire, it could indicate she'd traveled much farther from the trailhead than originally estimated. Bears have excellent scent detection capabilities, and it wasn't impossible that M47 had picked up and followed Claire's trail. But there were problems with that theory. First, black bears don't typically exhibit sustained tracking behavior over multiple days, unless they're following something that provides a significant food reward. Claire's jogging route didn't pass through any known food sources that would have motivated such persistent tracking. Second, the precision of M47's route seemed beyond what you'd expect from scent-based tracking. especially after several days of weather that should have degraded any scent trail. More troubling was what the search teams found when they followed M47's route. Despite having clear GPS coordinates for every location the bear had visited over 3 days, searchers found no evidence that Claire had ever been in any of those areas. No footprints, no torn clothing, no personal items, no signs of struggle or distress. The bear had apparently been following a route that Claire had never actually traveled. The search for Claire continued for 2 weeks, expanding to cover areas far beyond M47's tracking route. Volunteer teams, professional search and rescue personnel, and cadaver dogs searched hundreds of square miles of forest. They found no trace of Claire Dennison anywhere in the North Cascades, despite having detailed GPS data showing exactly where a 400-pound black bear had been traveling in the days following her disappearance. M47's tracking behavior stopped as abruptly as it had begun. On August 16th, his GPS coordinates showed him returning to normal movement patterns within his established home range. He resumed typical foraging behaviors, territorial movements, and seasonal activity patterns. It was as if the 3-day tracking episode had never happened, except for the detailed GPS record documenting every mile of his unusual journey. I spent weeks analyzing M47's tracking data, comparing it with weather records, food availability maps, and every other environmental factor that might explain his behavior. I consulted with wildlife behaviorists, bear researchers, and tracking specialists from universities across the Pacific Northwest. No one could provide a satisfactory explanation for why a black bear would exhibit such precise, sustained tracking behavior in the absence of any detectable trail or reward. The official search for Claire was suspended in early September, though it was never formally closed. The working theory was that she had suffered an accident or medical emergency in an area that hadn't been adequately searched, or that she had traveled much farther from her starting point than anyone had anticipated. M47's tracking data was included in the case file as potentially relevant information, but it wasn't considered conclusive evidence of Claire's actual route. I continued monitoring M47 through the fall and winter of 2023. His behavior remained completely normal, typical seasonal movements, predictable foraging patterns, standard territorial behaviors. He never again exhibited the kind of sustained, linear tracking that had characterized those 3 days in August. For all practical purposes, M47 returned to being a completely ordinary black bear. But I kept thinking about the precision of his tracking route and the complete absence of any evidence that Claire had ever been in the areas where M47 had traveled. How does a bear follow a trail that doesn't exist? What could motivate such specific, purposeful movement in the absence of any detectable stimulus? In spring of 2024, I hiked portions of M47's tracking route, trying to understand what he might have been following. The terrain was difficult, dense forest, steep slopes, and creek crossings that would have been challenging for both a human jogger and a 400-pound bear. There were no obvious landmarks or attractions that would have drawn either Claire or M47 to those specific locations. What struck me most was how isolated and quiet those areas were. Despite being within a few miles of popular hiking trails, M47's route passed through sections of forest that felt completely removed from human activity. They were the kind of places where someone could disappear without any possibility of accidental discovery, where events could occur without witnesses, where the only record of what happened might be the GPS coordinates from a radio collar on a black bear. I've continued working with our bear monitoring program, analyzing movement data and documenting behavioral patterns. M47 is still being tracked, still exhibiting normal black bear behaviors within his established territory. But sometimes, when I'm reviewing GPS data from our collared bears, I find myself wondering what other tracking behaviors might be hidden in the thousands of coordinate points we collect every month. The North Cascades are vast and largely uninhabited. Our radio-collared bears represent only a tiny fraction of the wildlife living in that ecosystem, and their tracking data provides just a narrow window into the complex interactions between animals and their environment. If M47 exhibited unprecedented tracking behavior for reasons we can't understand, what other unusual behaviors might be occurring in areas where we don't have the technology to observe and document them? Claire Dennison was never found. Her disappearance remains an open missing person case, though active search efforts ended more than a year ago. M47's 3-day tracking route is still part of the official case file, a record of impossible animal behavior that led searchers to places where they found no evidence of the person the bear had apparently been following. Sometimes I wonder if the relationship between missing people and wildlife behavior is more complex than we realize. Whether animals in the wilderness might be responding to events and stimuli that we can't detect or understand. Whether the GPS coordinates from a radio collar might sometimes document not just where an animal has been, but where something significant happened that we're not equipped to recognize. M47's tracking data from those 3 days in August remains the most detailed record we have of Claire Dennison's disappearance. It shows exactly where a 400-pound black bear traveled in the days after she vanished, following a route that led nowhere and documented a journey that shouldn't have been possible. That's all we know, and maybe that's all we're meant to know. The wilderness keeps its secrets, but sometimes it provides clues in the form of animal behavior that goes beyond normal patterns and expectations. Whether those clues lead to answers or just deeper mysteries might depend on how willing we are to accept that some tracking behaviors can't be explained by conventional understanding of predator and prey relationships. M47 is still out there, still being tracked by his GPS collar, still living his life as a normal black bear in the North Cascades. But sometimes I look at his current coordinates and wonder what he might know about those 3 days in August, and whether the trail he followed was something only he could detect. I'm Linda Cross. I've been working dispatch for the Olympic National Forest for 13 years, and I thought I understood the timing and logistics of search and rescue operations as well as anyone. Emergency calls come in, we dispatch appropriate teams, and they reach victims within predictable timeframes based on terrain, weather, and accessibility. It's systematic work with established protocols that rarely produce surprises until I received the call about Thomas Garrett on Millstone Ridge in October of 2023. The call came in at 6:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was covering the early shift, monitoring radio traffic and handling routine administrative calls when my emergency line lit up. The caller identified himself as Thomas Garrett, age 44, hiking alone on the Millstone Ridge Trail. He reported that he'd fallen and injured his leg, couldn't put weight on it, and needed assistance getting back to the trailhead. Thomas sounded calm and coherent, providing clear information about his location and condition. He said he'd been hiking since before dawn, using a headlamp to navigate the trail in the dark. He'd misjudged a rock step in the dim light, twisted his ankle, and heard something snap when he fell. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but he couldn't walk unassisted and was requesting a rescue team. I followed standard protocol, gathering Thomas's contact information, his exact location coordinates, and details about his condition and equipment. He was well prepared, had adequate clothing, water, food, and a first aid kit. His cell phone had sufficient battery and signal strength to maintain clear communication. He estimated his position as approximately 4 miles up the Millstone Ridge Trail, near a distinctive rock outcropping that I knew from previous rescue operations. Based on Thomas's location and the nature of his injury, I dispatched a 4-person search and rescue team at 6:51 a.m. The team leader was Kevin Martinez, a paramedic with over 8 years of mountain rescue experience. The terrain on Millstone Ridge is challenging but accessible, and Kevin estimated they could reach Thomas's position within 3 to 4 hours, depending on trail conditions and weather. I maintained regular radio contact with both Thomas and the rescue team throughout the morning. Thomas remained at his reported location, conserving energy and monitoring his injury. The rescue team made steady progress up the trail, reporting normal hiking conditions and no unusual obstacles. Everything about the operation was proceeding according to standard procedures. At 10:37 a.m., Kevin radioed that his team had located Thomas Garrett at the coordinates he'd provided. They confirmed his identity, assessed his injury as a probable ankle fracture, and began preparing him for evacuation. The operation was textbook, exactly the kind of routine rescue that demonstrates the effectiveness of our emergency response system. But when Kevin radioed his initial assessment, he mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. Thomas's watch had stopped at 6:39 a.m., apparently when he'd fallen and struck his wrist against the rocks. Kevin noted this detail because it would help establish the exact timing of the injury for his incident report. That meant Thomas's watch had stopped 3 minutes before he called to report the accident. I double-checked my call log to make sure I'd recorded the correct time. Thomas had definitely called at 6:42 a.m. I had the timestamp on the emergency line recording and multiple documentation in our dispatch system. But according to his watch, the injury that prompted his call had occurred at 6:39 a.m., 3 minutes later. It's possible for watches to be set incorrectly or to malfunction, so I didn't initially consider the discrepancy significant. But when Kevin asked Thomas about the timing of his fall, Thomas insisted that it had happened just moments before the rescue team arrived. According to Thomas, he'd been hiking in the pre-dawn darkness when he misjudged the rock step, fell, and injured his ankle. Then, within minutes, he'd heard voices and seen lights approaching through the forest. Thomas had no memory of calling for help, no recollection of spending 4 hours alone on the mountain waiting for rescue, and no awareness that significant time had passed between his injury and the arrival of the rescue team. As far as Thomas was concerned, his fall and rescue had occurred within a span of maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Kevin's team evacuated Thomas without incident, carrying him down the mountain on a rescue litter and transporting him to the regional medical center for treatment. His injury was confirmed as a displaced ankle fracture that required surgical repair, but he was otherwise in good health. The rescue operation was completed successfully, with no complications or unusual circumstances. Except for the impossible timeline that Thomas insisted was accurate. At the hospital, Thomas maintained his version of events, despite being shown documentation of the 4-hour gap between his injury and rescue. He acknowledged that his watch had stopped at 6:39 a.m., and he didn't dispute the recorded time of his emergency call at 6:42 a.m., but he insisted that those events had occurred within minutes of each other, not hours apart. Thomas had no memory of making the emergency call. When I played back the recorded conversation for the incident report, he recognized his own voice, but had no recollection of the conversation. According to Thomas, he'd fallen, assessed his injury, and was considering his options when he heard the rescue team approaching. He never remembered reaching for his phone or calling for help. The medical evaluation found no evidence of head injury, concussion, or other trauma that might have caused memory loss. Thomas's blood work was normal, with no indication of dehydration, medication effects, or medical conditions that could have caused confusion or disorientation. Neurological tests showed no abnormalities. According to every medical assessment, Thomas was a healthy 44-year-old man with no factors that would explain a 4-hour period of missing memory. I reviewed the emergency call recording multiple times, analyzing every detail of our conversation. Thomas had sounded completely normal, alert, coherent, and appropriately concerned about his situation. He'd provided accurate location information, described his injury clearly, and answered all my questions appropriately. There was nothing in his speech patterns or responses that suggested confusion, distress, or altered mental state. But the technical details of the call raised additional questions. Thomas's cell phone showed the outgoing call at 6:42 a.m., matching our dispatch records. However, the phone's internal log showed no other activity during the 4 hours he'd supposedly been waiting for rescue. No attempted calls, no text messages, no use of apps or emergency features. For someone stranded alone on a mountain with a serious injury, the complete absence of any phone activity seemed unusual. The GPS data from Thomas's phone provided the most puzzling evidence. The device had tracked his location continuously throughout his hike, showing normal movement up the Millstone Ridge Trail until 6:39 a.m., when the GPS indicated he'd stopped at the location where the rescue team eventually found him. But the GPS showed no movement or position changes between 6:39 a.m. and 10:37 a.m. when Kevin's team arrived. According to the GPS data, Thomas had remained in the exact same coordinates for 4 hours, not moving even a few feet, despite being conscious and able to communicate. Most people with injuries that allow them to make phone calls would shift position occasionally, try to find more comfortable seating, or move to signal rescuers. The GPS suggested that Thomas had remained absolutely motionless from the moment of his fall until the moment of his rescue. I consulted with our search and rescue coordinator about the unusual aspects of Thomas's case. The coordinator reviewed all the documentation and agreed that the timeline discrepancy was puzzling, but noted that traumatic injuries can sometimes cause temporary memory problems. The important thing was that Thomas had been rescued successfully and received appropriate medical treatment. The incident report classified Thomas's rescue as routine, with a note about possible short-term memory loss related to his injury. The timeline discrepancy was documented, but not considered significant enough to warrant further investigation. Thomas recovered fully from his ankle surgery and returned to hiking within a few months, but I couldn't stop thinking about the 3-minute gap between when Thomas's watch stopped and when he called for help, or the 4 hours he couldn't remember spending alone on the mountain. In 13 years of dispatch work, I'd handled hundreds of emergency calls from injured hikers, and I'd never encountered a case where someone had lost hours of memory while remaining conscious and coherent enough to provide detailed location information. What disturbed me most was the quality of Thomas's emergency call. He'd sounded like someone who had just experienced an accident and was calling for help immediately afterward. There was no indication in his voice or manner that he'd been dealing with his injury for hours, no mention of growing cold or concerned about the passage of time. He'd sounded exactly like someone calling within minutes of his fall. I've continued working dispatch, handling emergency calls, and coordinating rescue operations throughout the Olympic National Forest. Most cases follow predictable patterns, with logical timelines and clear cause and effect relationships. But occasionally, I receive calls that make me wonder about the gaps between what we can document and what actually happens during the hours people spend alone in the wilderness. The mountains change people's perception of time, create conditions where minutes can feel like hours, or hours can pass without notice. But Thomas's case was different. It involved specific documented evidence that contradicted his lived experience of events. His watch, his phone records, and the GPS data all told one story, while his memory told another. Sometimes I wonder how many other rescue calls involve similar timeline discrepancies that we don't notice because the victims don't mention them. How many people experience gaps in memory or perception during emergency situations, but assume their confusion is normal and don't report the inconsistencies? How many times might we be responding to calls that were made hours after the people think they made them? Thomas's call recording is still in our dispatch archives, a clear conversation with timestamps that don't align with the caller's memory of events. When I listen to it now, I find myself focusing on the background sounds, wind through trees, distant bird calls, the normal sounds of morning in the forest. Everything sounds completely normal for a routine emergency call, except for the impossible timing that suggests it wasn't routine at all. The Millstone Ridge Trail remains one of our most popular hiking destinations, and we continue to receive emergency calls from that area several times each year. Most are straightforward rescues, with clear timelines and predictable outcomes. But sometimes, when I'm taking an emergency call from someone who sounds confused about how much time has passed since their accident, I think about Thomas Garrett and wonder what really happens during the hours that people can't remember. Time moves differently in the wilderness, following patterns that don't always align with the measurements on our watches and phones. Maybe that's enough of an explanation. Maybe some experiences exist in the spaces between what we can document and what we can understand, leaving only questions about the reliability of memory and the nature of time itself. Thomas's watch still showed 6:39 a.m. when the rescue team found him 4 hours later. That's a fact we can verify and document. Whether those 4 hours existed in the way we normally understand time, or in some other way that defies our normal frameworks, might be a question that doesn't need an answer. I'm Dr. Alex Morrison. I've been working as an environmental scientist for the Oregon State Police for 9 years, specializing in forensic soil analysis and site investigation. My job involves applying scientific methods to criminal investigations, analyzing soil composition, documenting environmental evidence, and providing expert testimony about what the Earth can tell us about human activity. It's methodical work that relies on established scientific principles and reproducible results until I analyzed the soil samples from Cascade Creek in November of 2023. The case began when hunters discovered what appeared to be a shallow burial site in a remote section of the Mount Hood National Forest. The site was located about 3 miles from the nearest road, in dense forest that sees very little human activity outside of hunting season. A depression in the ground, approximately 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, had caught the attention of 2 experienced hunters who recognized it as potentially significant and contacted law enforcement. Detective Sarah Kim from the Oregon State Police requested my assistance in determining whether the site contained human remains and, if so, establishing a timeline for when the burial might have occurred. The location was consistent with body disposal sites we'd investigated previously: remote, difficult to access, and unlikely to be discovered accidentally. Standard procedure required comprehensive soil analysis before any excavation began. I arrived at the site on November 7th with a full field investigation kit, including equipment for soil sampling, GPS mapping, and preliminary chemical analysis. The area was exactly as the hunters had described: a slight depression in the forest floor, surrounded by mature Douglas fir and western hemlock trees. The depression was subtle but clearly artificial, with edges that suggested intentional excavation rather than natural erosion or animal activity. My initial assessment focused on documenting the site's physical characteristics and collecting soil samples from multiple locations within and around the suspected burial area. I established a grid system to ensure systematic coverage and collected samples at various depths to analyze soil composition and detect any chemical indicators of decomposition. The work was routine, following protocols I'd used at dozens of similar sites over the years. The first indication that something was unusual came from my portable chemical analysis kit. Field tests for organic decomposition markers showed strong positive results from soil samples taken within the depression. The chemical signatures were consistent with human decomposition: elevated nitrogen levels, specific pH changes, and trace compounds that indicate the breakdown of human tissue and bone. These results suggested that human remains had indeed been buried at this location. However, the visual and physical characteristics of the soil didn't match what I'd expect from a recent burial site. The soil layers showed no obvious signs of disturbance or mixing that typically result from excavation and backfilling. The organic matter distribution appeared natural and undisturbed, with normal root penetration patterns and insect activity. For a site that was testing positive for human decomposition, the soil structure looked remarkably undisturbed. I collected comprehensive samples for laboratory analysis and requested ground-penetrating radar survey of the area. Ground-penetrating radar can detect subsurface disturbances, buried objects, and changes in soil density that indicate previous excavation. It's standard procedure for suspected burial sites, and the results usually provide clear evidence of whether soil has been disturbed and when that disturbance might have occurred. The laboratory results from my soil samples came back 2 weeks later with findings that immediately caught my attention. All chemical analyses confirmed the presence of human decomposition markers at levels consistent with a body that had been buried and decomposed over a period of several years. The concentrations and distribution patterns strongly suggested that human remains had been present in that soil for an extended period. But the ground-penetrating radar results contradicted everything the chemical analysis had indicated. The radar survey showed completely undisturbed soil layers extending down to bedrock at approximately 8 feet depth. The soil stratigraphy was consistent with natural deposition over many decades, with no evidence of excavation, backfilling, or any human disturbance. According to the radar data, the soil at that site hadn't been disturbed in over 50 years. I'd never encountered such a direct contradiction between chemical and physical evidence. Human decomposition produces unmistakable chemical signatures that persist in soil for years after remains are removed. But those chemicals don't appear naturally. They require the presence of decomposing human tissue. Meanwhile, ground-penetrating radar is highly accurate at detecting soil disturbance, and the results clearly showed that no excavation had ever occurred at that location. Thinking there might have been contamination or error in my analysis, I submitted duplicate samples to 2 additional laboratories for independent verification. Both labs confirmed my original findings: strong, positive results for human decomposition markers throughout the soil from the suspected burial site. The chemical evidence was consistent across 3 separate laboratories using different analytical methods. I also requested a second ground-penetrating radar survey from a different contractor, using more sensitive equipment and expanded coverage area. The second survey confirmed the original results: no evidence of soil disturbance at any depth, with natural soil layers that appeared to have been undisturbed for decades. The radar operators noted that the soil structure was remarkably uniform and consistent with long-term natural processes. Detective Kim was as puzzled by the contradictory results as I was. We'd both worked numerous burial site investigations, and neither of us had encountered a situation where chemical and physical evidence provided such fundamentally incompatible conclusions. The chemical evidence strongly suggested human remains had decomposed in that soil, while the physical evidence clearly indicated that no burial had ever taken place. We decided to conduct a careful excavation of the site to resolve the contradiction. If human remains were present, excavation would locate them, regardless of what the ground-penetrating radar had indicated. If no remains were found, it might help explain the source of the chemical anomalies. The excavation was conducted systematically, with careful documentation of soil layers and any artifacts or evidence discovered. The excavation revealed absolutely nothing. No human remains, no artifacts, no evidence of previous excavation or disturbance. The soil layers matched exactly what the ground-penetrating radar had predicted: natural deposition with undisturbed stratigraphy extending down to bedrock. We excavated the entire suspected burial area to a depth of 6 feet and found only natural forest soil, root systems, and small rocks. But soil samples collected during the excavation continued to test positive for human decomposition markers. Even as we were digging through obviously undisturbed soil layers, chemical analysis showed the same elevated nitrogen levels, pH changes, and trace compounds that indicate human decomposition. The chemical evidence persisted despite the complete absence of any physical evidence that human remains had ever been present. I consulted with forensic anthropologists, soil scientists, and other environmental specialists about the case. No one could provide a satisfactory explanation for how soil could contain clear chemical evidence of human decomposition while showing no physical evidence of disturbance or burial. The chemical signatures we detected don't occur naturally and require the presence of decomposing human tissue to develop. One theory was that remains might have been buried and later removed, leaving only chemical traces in the soil. But that didn't explain the ground-penetrating radar results, which would have detected evidence of excavation even if it had occurred decades earlier. Another theory suggested that the chemical signatures might have resulted from surface decomposition rather than burial, but the concentration and distribution patterns were inconsistent with that explanation. The most disturbing possibility was that we were dealing with some kind of unknown process that could produce chemical evidence of human decomposition without any actual human remains being present. But that would contradict fundamental principles of forensic science and everything we understand about how decomposition chemistry works in soil environments. The case was eventually closed without resolution. The site showed no evidence of criminal activity, no human remains were recovered, and there were no missing person reports that correlated with the location or time frame. The contradictory evidence was documented in our files. But since no crime could be established, no further investigation was warranted. I've continued working forensic soil analysis cases throughout Oregon, following the same scientific protocols and analytical methods I've used for years. My techniques and equipment continue to produce reliable, consistent results that support successful criminal investigations. But I've never again encountered chemical evidence that contradicts physical evidence so completely and inexplicably. The soil samples from Cascade Creek are still stored in our evidence facility, properly preserved and cataloged. Occasionally, when I'm training new technicians or reviewing unusual cases, I bring out those samples as examples of the limitations of forensic science. They serve as reminders that even well-established analytical methods can sometimes produce results that challenge our understanding of what's possible. What continues to disturb me about the Cascade Creek case isn't just the contradiction between chemical and physical evidence, but the implications of what that contradiction might mean. If soil can contain unmistakable chemical evidence of human decomposition without any human remains ever being present, what other assumptions about forensic science might be incorrect? What other cases might involve evidence that seems conclusive but actually represents something we don't understand? I still visit the Cascade Creek site occasionally, usually when I'm conducting training exercises or field research in that area. The depression that originally attracted the hunters' attention has been filled in and shows no signs of our excavation work. The forest has returned to its normal appearance, with no indication that anything unusual was ever discovered there. But sometimes, when I'm collecting routine soil samples from other locations, I find myself wondering what chemical signatures might be present in soil that appears completely normal. How many sites throughout the forest might contain evidence of events that never happened, or that happened in ways we're not equipped to understand? How many contradictions between chemical and physical evidence might we miss because we don't test soil that doesn't look suspicious? The Mount Hood National Forest encompasses over 1 million acres of wilderness, most of which has never been subjected to forensic analysis. Our investigations represent only a tiny fraction of the area, focusing on sites that appear suspicious or are associated with specific criminal cases. If the Cascade Creek site contained impossible evidence, what other impossible evidence might be present in areas we'll never have reason to investigate? The scientific method requires reproducible results and logical consistency between different types of evidence. When those principles break down, it usually indicates problems with methodology, equipment, or interpretation. But sometimes, maybe it indicates that there are aspects of the natural world that don't conform to our current understanding of how things work. The soil samples from Cascade Creek continue to test positive for human decomposition markers 9 months after they were collected. The chemical signatures remain strong and consistent, providing clear evidence that human remains decomposed in that soil, despite the complete absence of any physical evidence that human remains were ever present. That's what the science tells us, even though it doesn't make sense according to everything else we know about decomposition chemistry and soil analysis. I suppose that's enough. Some evidence doesn't need to point toward conclusions that we can understand or accept. Sometimes it's sufficient to document what we find and preserve it for future analysis, even when current analytical methods can't reconcile contradictory results. The forest keeps its secrets, but occasionally it offers glimpses of processes that exist beyond our current ability to explain or categorize. I'm Ranger Paula Vance. I've been conducting wildlife population surveys in the Adirondack State Park for 12 years, and I thought I understood the movement patterns and behavioral limitations of the animals I study. Nocturnal mammals, like raccoons, have predictable ranges, travel at known speeds, and follow logical patterns based on food availability and territorial boundaries. But during an overnight survey in September of 2023, I documented movement patterns that challenged everything I knew about wildlife behavior and the basic physics of animal locomotion. The overnight survey was part of our annual population assessment, designed to count nocturnal mammals across a representative sample of the park's ecosystem. My assigned area covered approximately 30 square miles of mixed forest, wetlands, and meadows in the northeastern section of the park. The work involves driving designated routes, stopping at predetermined observation points, and using spotlights and infrared cameras to count and photograph wildlife for later analysis. I started the survey at sunset on September 22nd, beginning at the northern boundary of my assigned area and working systematically south through a grid of observation points. The weather was ideal for wildlife observation: clear skies, minimal wind, and temperatures in the mid-50s that keep animals active without affecting their normal behavior patterns. I expected a routine night of counting deer, raccoons, opossums, and the occasional black bear. The first raccoon sighting occurred at 8:37 p.m. at Observation Point 7, near Cranberry Lake. I spotted a family group consisting of 2 adults and 2 juveniles foraging along the shoreline. Standard procedure requires photographing each sighting for verification and analysis. So I documented the family with both visible light and infrared images. The raccoons appeared healthy and exhibited normal foraging behavior, paying little attention to my vehicle, parked 50 yards away. What made this sighting notable was the distinctive markings on one of the adult raccoons. She had an unusual white patch on her left front paw and a distinctive scar across her tail that made her easily identifiable. These kinds of natural markings are valuable for wildlife researchers because they allow us to track individual animals and study their behavior over time. I made detailed notes about the family's location, composition, and the distinctive markings. At 9:52 p.m., approximately 15 miles south of the first sighting, I encountered what appeared to be the same raccoon family at Observation Point 12, near Raquette River. The group composition was identical: 2 adults and 2 juveniles, and the female had the same distinctive white patch and tail scar. They were engaged in typical raccoon behavior, washing food in shallow water at the river's edge. Initially, I assumed I'd made an error in my location tracking or timing. Raccoons can travel significant distances in search of food, and it was possible that the family had moved between the 2 locations during the hour and 15 minutes between sightings. But 15 miles was an unusually long distance for raccoons to travel in such a short time, especially when both locations offered abundant food sources that should have kept them occupied for hours. Over the next 6 hours, I continued to encounter what appeared to be the same raccoon family at increasingly distant locations throughout my survey area. Each sighting was carefully documented with photographs, GPS coordinates, and detailed behavioral observations. By dawn, I had photographed the distinctive family group at 17 different locations across the 30 square mile survey area. The documented timeline made their movements impossible. Between the 3rd and 4th sightings, the raccoons would have needed to travel 12 miles in 37 minutes to appear at both locations. Between the 7th and 8th sightings, they would have needed to cover 18 miles in 22 minutes. Even assuming the raccoons traveled in perfectly straight lines, with no stops for foraging or rest, the required travel speeds exceeded the physical capabilities of raccoons by factors of 10 or more. But the photographic evidence was clear and consistent. Each sighting showed the same family composition, with identical, distinctive markings on the same individuals. The female's white paw patch and tail scar were clearly visible in every photograph, captured from multiple angles and lighting conditions. The size relationships between family members were consistent, and their behavioral interactions matched what I'd observed during the first sighting. I completed the survey at dawn, having documented what appeared to be the same 4 raccoons at 17 different locations, spanning an area that would require hours of continuous travel to traverse on foot. My survey protocol required submitting all photographic evidence for analysis by our wildlife research team, so I provided detailed documentation of each sighting, along with my concerns about the impossible movement patterns. Dr. Sarah Chen, our wildlife research coordinator, reviewed my photographs and field notes with the same confusion I'd experienced. The visual evidence clearly showed the same individual animals at multiple locations, but the timing and distances made their documented movements physically impossible. To resolve the discrepancy, Dr. Chen recommended genetic analysis of hair and scat samples I'd collected at several of the sighting locations. Genetic testing takes several weeks, but it can definitively determine whether samples came from the same individual animals or from different animals with similar appearance. If my photographs showed different raccoon families that happened to look similar, genetic analysis would reveal the differences. If the samples all came from the same 4 individuals, it would confirm that I'd somehow documented impossible animal movements. The genetic analysis results came back 6 weeks later, with findings that made the situation even more puzzling. All 17 samples, hair and scat, collected from locations spanning 30 square miles, came from the same 4 individual raccoons. The genetic markers were identical across all samples, confirming that 1 adult male, 1 adult female, and 2 juveniles had somehow been present at 17 different locations during my 8-hour survey. Dr. Chen consulted with geneticists at Cornell University and the State University of New York to verify our results. Independent analysis of duplicate samples confirmed our findings. The genetic evidence was conclusive. I had documented the same 4 raccoons at 17 locations that would have required them to travel over 200 miles in 8 hours, often moving between locations that were separated by distances requiring speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour. The case attracted attention from wildlife behaviorists and movement ecology specialists throughout the Northeast. Several researchers requested copies of my photographs and genetic data, hoping to find explanations for the documented movements. Theories ranged from equipment malfunction to observer error to unknown raccoon behavior patterns, but none adequately explained the combination of photographic and genetic evidence. One possibility was that my camera's timestamp was malfunctioning, creating false impressions about the timing of different sightings. But I'd cross-referenced the camera timestamps with my field notes, GPS logs, and vehicle odometer readings. The timing data was consistent across multiple independent sources, and there was no evidence of equipment malfunction. Another theory suggested that I might have encountered different raccoon families with remarkably similar markings and appearance. But genetic analysis had ruled out that possibility. The samples definitely came from the same 4 individual animals. The genetic markers were as unique and distinctive as fingerprints, leaving no room for mistaken identity. The most disturbing possibility was that the raccoons had somehow been present at multiple locations simultaneously, violating basic assumptions about animal movement and physical laws. But that explanation required accepting that 4 raccoons could exist in 17 different places during the same 8-hour period, which challenged fundamental principles of biology and physics. The official incident report classified my survey results as anomalous data requiring further study. The genetic evidence was filed with our research database, and my photographs were archived as examples of unusual wildlife behavior that couldn't be explained by current understanding of animal movement pattern. No formal conclusions were drawn about the cause of the documented anomalies. I've continued conducting nocturnal wildlife surveys using the same protocols and equipment I'd used that night in September. My subsequent surveys have produced normal, predictable results consistent with established understanding of wildlife behavior and movement capabilities. I've never again documented impossible animal movements or encountered the same raccoon family. But the genetic samples from that night remain in our research facility. Physical evidence that 4 individual raccoons were somehow present at 17 locations across 30 square miles during 8 hours of observation. The samples continue to yield identical genetic markers when retested, confirming that my documentation was accurate, even though it describes events that shouldn't be possible. What disturbs me most about that night isn't just the impossible movements I documented, but the mundane normality of each individual sighting. Every encounter with the raccoon family showed completely typical behavior: foraging, washing food, normal family interactions. There was nothing unusual about their actions or appearance except for their presence in locations where they couldn't logically have been. Sometimes, when I'm conducting routine surveys in the same area, I find myself looking for raccoons with distinctive markings, hoping to spot the white paw patch or distinctive tail scar that would indicate I'd encountered the same family again. I never have, but I occasionally photograph raccoon families that seem familiar, that trigger memories of that impossible night when 4 animals somehow existed in 17 places at once. The Adirondacks encompass over 6 million acres of wilderness, most of which is surveyed only occasionally by researchers like me. Our population studies represent tiny samples of the complex ecosystems that exist throughout the park, and we observe only fragments of the behavior patterns and movement capabilities of the animals that live there. If one raccoon family could exhibit impossible movement patterns during a single night, what other impossible behaviors might be occurring in areas we don't monitor regularly? Wildlife surveys are designed to document normal, predictable animal behavior that fits within established scientific frameworks. When we encounter anomalies that challenge those frameworks, we typically assume equipment failure, observer error, or unusual but explainable circumstances. We don't expect to find genetic evidence of physical impossibilities, documented with careful precision and verified through multiple independent sources. The raccoon family from that September night exists somewhere in the Adirondacks, probably following normal movement patterns and exhibiting typical behaviors. They might occasionally be photographed by other researchers conducting population surveys, appearing in images as ordinary raccoons living ordinary raccoon lives. But the genetic samples in our research facility prove that for 8 hours, those 4 individuals somehow transcended the normal limitations of space and time, existing in multiple locations simultaneously, without any apparent awareness that they were accomplishing something impossible. I still carry copies of those 17 photographs in my survey equipment. Images of the same 4 raccoons captured at locations spanning 30 square miles during a single night. When I look at them now, I find myself focusing on the background details, the different vegetation, the varying terrain, the changing light conditions that confirm these were genuinely different locations photographed hours apart. Everything about the images appears completely normal, except for the presence of animals that couldn't possibly have been where I found them. The mountains and forests keep their secrets, but sometimes they offer glimpses of possibilities that exist beyond our current understanding of how the natural world works. Maybe that's enough. Maybe some wildlife behaviors don't need to conform to established scientific principles, as long as they remind us that there are still aspects of the wilderness that exceed our ability to categorize and explain. I'm Ryan Walsh. I've been working communications for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 7 years, monitoring radio traffic and coordinating emergency responses from our dispatch center. My job involves maintaining constant contact with rangers in the field, processing emergency calls, and ensuring that help reaches people who need it as quickly as possible. It's systematic work that relies on clear protocols and established procedures, until I received a radio transmission in March of 2024 that challenged everything I understood about communication technology: the finality of death. The transmission came in at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday night during my regular overnight shift. I was monitoring multiple radio frequencies while processing routine administrative traffic when our emergency channel activated with a clear, professional voice requesting immediate backup. The caller identified himself using proper protocol, provided specific location coordinates, and described a domestic violence incident requiring law enforcement assistance. What made the transmission immediately notable was the voice. I recognized it instantly as belonging to Ranger Jack Patterson, who had been killed in a car accident 6 months earlier while driving home from work during an ice storm. Jack had been with the Park Service for 14 years, and I'd spoken with him over the radio hundreds of times during his career. His voice was distinctive, calm, professional, with a slight Tennessee accent that made him easily identifiable even through radio static. But Jack Patterson had been dead since September of 2023. I assumed I was experiencing some kind of audio equipment malfunction or interference from another radio system. Emergency frequencies occasionally pick up transmissions from distant sources during atmospheric conditions that allow radio signals to travel unusual distances. It's possible for dispatch centers to receive calls intended for agencies hundreds of miles away, creating confusion about location and jurisdiction. However, the transmission content was too specific and accurate to be accidental interference. The caller used our exact radio protocols, correct call signs for our park system, and provided coordinates that fell within our jurisdiction. He reported a domestic violence incident at a specific location near Cataract Falls, requested immediate law enforcement backup, and indicated that the situation involved potential weapons. Everything about the transmission followed standard emergency procedures. I followed protocol and dispatched available units to the coordinates provided in the transmission. Rangers Mike Torres and Susan Collins were on patrol in that area and could reach the location within 20 minutes. I radioed them with the incident details, noting that the initial report had come from an unidentified caller who might be a witness or someone involved in the situation. While Torres and Collins were en route, I attempted to re-establish contact with the original caller. Standard procedure requires maintaining communication with reporting parties to gather additional information and coordinate response efforts. But despite multiple attempts on all available frequencies, I received no response from whoever had made the initial report. Torres and Collins reached the Cataract Falls area at 12:17 a.m. and began searching for signs of the reported domestic violence incident. The coordinates provided in the radio transmission led them to a remote camping area about half a mile from the main trail, accessible only by hiking through dense forest. It was an isolated location that rarely sees visitor activity during winter months. What they found was a crime scene that had obviously been there for months. The campsite contained evidence of a violent struggle that had occurred during the previous fall. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the area, including camping gear, clothing, and identification documents belonging to Maria Santos, a 28-year-old woman from Atlanta, who had been reported missing in October of 2023. The scene showed clear signs of violence, with damaged camping equipment and blood evidence that had been weathered by months of exposure. Maria Santos had been reported missing by her family when she failed to return from a planned solo camping trip in the Smokies. Her car had been found at a trailhead parking area, but despite extensive search efforts by park rangers and volunteer teams, no trace of Maria had been discovered. The search had been suspended after 2 weeks, with the assumption that she had suffered an accident in a remote area that hadn't been adequately covered by search teams. But Torres and Collins had found Maria's campsite exactly where the radio transmission had indicated there was an active domestic violence situation. The location was within the area that had been searched during the October operation, but somehow the crime scene had been missed by multiple search teams using GPS coordinates and systematic grid pattern. The investigation that followed revealed evidence suggesting that Maria had been murdered by someone she knew, possibly a former boyfriend who had followed her to the park. The crime scene contained physical evidence linking the incident to domestic violence, exactly as described in the radio transmission I'd received. But the violence had occurred months earlier, not on the night when someone claiming to be Jack Patterson had called for backup. I provided investigators with a recording of the radio transmission, though I was reluctant to mention that the voice belonged to a deceased ranger. The recording clearly captured the caller's voice, his use of proper protocols, and his accurate description of a domestic violence incident at coordinates that led directly to Maria's campsite. but explaining that the voice belonged to someone who had been dead for 6 months seemed likely to undermine the credibility of crucial evidence. Detective Lisa Morgan, who led the investigation into Maria's death, listened to the radio transmission multiple times and noted that the caller demonstrated detailed knowledge of park radio procedures and geographic landmarks. She asked me if I could identify the caller or explain how someone outside the Park Service could have acquired such specific knowledge of our protocols and coordinate systems. I told Detective Morgan that the voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't definitively identify the caller. That was technically true. While I was certain the voice belonged to Jack Patterson, I couldn't prove it in a way that would be useful for the investigation. The recording quality was typical for radio transmissions, clear enough to understand, but not suitable for voice analysis or legal identification purposes. The investigation into Maria's death eventually led to the arrest of her ex-boyfriend, Robert Chen, who had been stalking her despite a restraining order. Physical evidence at the campsite and cell phone records confirmed that Robert had followed Maria to the Smokies and killed her during what he later claimed was an argument that escalated beyond his intentions. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But the investigation never explained how the crime scene had been discovered 6 months after the murder, or who had made the radio transmission that led Torres and Collins to the exact location where Maria had died. Detective Morgan noted in her report that the case had been solved through an anonymous tip received by Park Dispatch, but she didn't pursue the identity of the caller since the physical evidence was sufficient for prosecution. I kept the recording of Jack Patterson's transmission in our communication logs, filed as an anonymous report that had led to the discovery of important evidence. Officially, the caller's identity remained unknown, and the timing of the report was treated as fortunate coincidence rather than something requiring explanation. The important thing was that Maria's family finally had answers, and her killer had been brought to justice. But I couldn't stop thinking about the impossibility of what I'd heard. Jack Patterson's voice was unmistakable to anyone who had worked with him regularly. His speech patterns, his use of specific terminology, and his calm, professional manner were all exactly as I remembered from hundreds of previous radio conversations. The transmission hadn't been a recording or some kind of audio manipulation. It was Jack's voice, speaking live, describing an active situation that required immediate response. Jack had been buried in Gatlinburg 6 months before I received his radio call. I'd attended his funeral, along with dozens of other Park Service employees who respected his years of dedicated service. His radio call sign had been officially retired, his equipment returned to inventory, and his position filled by a new ranger who had been trained on different frequencies and protocols. Yet somehow, Jack's voice had come through our emergency channel at exactly the right time to lead investigators to a crime scene they'd missed during their initial search efforts. The transmission had provided specific, accurate information that solved a murder case and brought closure to Maria Santos's family. It had served a purpose that no living person had been able to accomplish. I've continued working communications for the Park Service, monitoring radio traffic and coordinating emergency responses using the same equipment and procedures I've used for years. My radio systems have never again received transmissions from deceased personnel, never again provided information that solved unsolved crimes. The communication equipment functions normally, following established principles of radio technology and electromagnetic transmission. But I've kept that recording from March, archived in our digital storage system, as documentation of an anonymous tip that proved crucial to a murder investigation. Sometimes, during quiet overnight shifts, when I'm monitoring multiple frequencies, I listen to Jack Patterson's voice describing the domestic violence incident at Cataract Falls, requesting backup that arrived 6 months too late to save Maria Santos, but just in time to ensure her killer faced justice. The Great Smoky Mountains encompass over 500,000 acres of wilderness, much of it accessible only to experienced hikers and rarely visited by park personnel. Our radio coverage extends throughout most of the park, but there are areas where transmission quality is poor, and communication can be difficult. If Jack Patterson could somehow transmit from beyond death to report a crime that needed solving, what other voices might be trying to reach us from locations where help arrived too late? Emergency frequencies are designed to carry urgent messages from people who need immediate assistance. Most of the transmissions we receive are straightforward lost hikers, medical emergencies, equipment failures that require rescue operations. We respond to each call according to established protocols, dispatching appropriate resources and documenting outcomes for administrative review. But occasionally, maybe we receive calls from people who are beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations, reporting situations that require different kinds of response. Maybe some emergencies transcend the normal limitations of time and space, allowing voices to carry messages across boundaries that shouldn't be permeable to radio transmissions. Jack Patterson's call led us to Maria Santos's killer and provided her family with answers they'd been seeking for months. That's what matters most, not the impossibility of the transmission, but the justice it helped achieve. Some mysteries don't need to be solved as long as they serve purposes that living people couldn't accomplish on their own. The radio equipment continues to function normally, processing routine traffic and emergency calls according to established procedures. But sometimes, during quiet overnight shifts, I find myself listening more carefully to the background static, wondering if other voices might be trying to reach us with information we need to hear. The mountains keep their secrets, but occasionally they allow the dead to speak when the living have failed to find the truth. I'm Detective Susan Parks. I've been working cases that involve the Cascade Range wilderness areas for 11 years, specializing in missing persons, suspicious deaths, and criminal activity that occurs in or around national and state parks. My job involves coordinating with park rangers, search and rescue teams, and federal agencies to investigate incidents that happen in some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the Pacific Northwest. It's work that requires patience, attention to detail, and acceptance that some cases will never have satisfactory resolutions until I started receiving calls from someone who seemed to know things he shouldn't have been able to know. The first call came in February of 2022, around 9:30 on a Tuesday evening. Our dispatch received a report from someone identifying himself only as Eddie, claiming to have information about a missing person. The caller said he was homeless, living in the forests around Mount Rainier, and that he'd found evidence that someone named Jennifer Walsh had died somewhere near Paradise Valley. He provided a physical description of Jennifer, details about her car and camping equipment, and specific coordinates where he believed her body could be found. What made the call notable was the precision of Eddie's information. He knew Jennifer's full name, her age, her hometown in Oregon, and accurate details about her planned hiking itinerary. He described her tent, backpack, and clothing with specificity that suggested he'd either encountered Jennifer personally or had access to information that wasn't publicly available. But there was no missing person report for anyone named Jennifer Walsh, and our databases showed no record of her being reported overdue or lost. I treated Eddie's call as a potential tip about an unreported missing person case and forwarded his information to Mount Rainier National Park rangers for follow-up. 3 days later, rangers found Jennifer Walsh's body at coordinates that were within 50 yards of what Eddie had provided. Jennifer had apparently died from exposure after becoming lost during a solo hiking trip that her family hadn't yet realized was overdue. Her death was ruled accidental, but Eddie's advanced knowledge of her identity and location raised questions we couldn't answer. The second call came in July of 2022. Eddie contacted our dispatch again, this time reporting that someone named Marcus Chen had gone missing near Mount Baker and would be found dead in a ravine off the Heather Meadows Trail. He provided Marcus's age, physical description, vehicle information, and details about his hiking plans that proved completely accurate when we verified them against Marcus's actual itinerary. Eddie also mentioned that Marcus had been hiking alone, and had fallen while attempting to cross a creek swollen by recent rainfall. Rangers found Marcus Chen's body exactly where Eddie had indicated, under circumstances that matched his description precisely. Marcus had indeed fallen while crossing a creek and had died from injuries sustained during the fall. The death was accidental. But once again, Eddie had demonstrated impossible knowledge of a missing person who hadn't yet been reported missing by his family. Marcus's hiking plans had been shared only with his roommate, who wasn't expecting him back for another 3 days. After the second call, I began actively trying to locate Eddie, to understand how he was acquiring such accurate information about missing hikers. I worked with park rangers throughout the Cascade Range to search for homeless individuals living in wilderness areas, hoping to find someone who matched Eddie's voice and could explain his knowledge of missing persons cases. But despite extensive efforts, no one had encountered a homeless man named Eddie, and our searches of potential camping areas found no evidence of long-term habitation. The third call came in November of 2022. Eddie reported that Lisa Morrison, a photographer from Seattle, had died in a landslide near Stevens Pass. He provided Lisa's complete physical description, details about her photography equipment, and specific coordinates for where her body could be recovered. He also mentioned that Lisa had been photographing autumn colors when the landslide occurred, and that her camera contained images that would help establish the timeline of her death. Rangers located Lisa Morrison's body at the coordinates Eddie provided, buried under debris from a recent landslide, exactly as he'd described. Her camera was recovered intact and contained time-stamped photographs that confirmed she'd been taking pictures of fall foliage when the landslide struck her location. The death was ruled accidental, caused by an unpredictable geological event that couldn't have been anticipated or avoided. But Eddie's knowledge of Lisa's death was impossible to explain through normal means. The landslide had occurred in a remote area with no witnesses, and Lisa's body was completely buried under several tons of rock and soil. No one could have known about her death without either being present when it happened or having access to information that didn't exist until rangers conducted their recovery operation. The fourth and final call came in August of 2023. Eddie reported that David Kim, a backpacker from Portland, had died from a heart attack while hiking alone near Mount Adams. He provided David's age, physical description, hiking itinerary, and details about his medical history that included a previously undiagnosed heart condition. Eddie also mentioned that David's death had occurred near a small alpine lake where he'd stopped to filter water. Rangers found David Kim's body beside an alpine lake approximately 2 miles from the nearest trail, dead from what the medical examiner later confirmed was a massive heart attack caused by an undiagnosed cardiac condition. David had apparently been filtering water when he collapsed and died instantly. His death was ruled natural, but Eddie's advanced knowledge of David's identity, location, and cause of death was as impossible to explain as his previous reports had been. Over 18 months, Eddie had provided our department with 4 missing person reports that proved completely accurate in every detail. He'd known the names, ages, physical descriptions, and exact locations of 4 people who had died in wilderness accidents before their deaths had been discovered or reported by anyone else. His information had been precise enough to guide rangers directly to bodies that might otherwise have remained undiscovered for weeks or months. But despite extensive efforts, we'd never been able to locate Eddie or understand how he was acquiring his information. Park rangers throughout the Cascade Range had searched for homeless individuals living in wilderness areas, but found no evidence of long-term camps or anyone matching Eddie's description. Social services agencies had no records of anyone named Eddie who fit the profile of our caller. He remained completely elusive, despite providing information that proved crucial to 4 separate death investigations. What disturbed me most about Eddie's calls wasn't just his impossible knowledge, but the timing of his reports. In each case, he'd contacted our dispatch within hours of when the deaths had occurred, often before family members or friends had realized the victims were overdue. His calls consistently came in during the narrow window between when someone died and when their absence would be noticed by people who cared about them. The pattern suggested that Eddie was somehow present when these deaths occurred, witnessing accidents in remote wilderness areas where no one else should have been. But if he was present at the scenes, why didn't he attempt to provide assistance or report the incidents immediately? Why did he wait hours before calling? And why did he never remain at the locations to meet responding rangers? I consulted with psychologists and criminal profilers about Eddie's behavior, wondering if he might be responsible for the deaths he was reporting. But all 4 deaths had been thoroughly investigated and ruled accidental or natural. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs that anyone else had been present at the scenes, and no indication that the victims had encountered another person before their deaths. The medical evidence was clear and consistent. Jennifer had died from exposure, Marcus from trauma sustained in a fall, Lisa from injuries caused by a landslide, and David from natural heart failure. All 4 deaths had occurred exactly as Eddie described them, under circumstances that matched his advanced knowledge, but showed no signs of human intervention or criminal activity. Eddie's final call in August of 2023 was the last time our dispatch heard from him. Despite continued efforts to locate him throughout the following year, no one matching his description has been found in any of the wilderness areas where he claimed to be living. It's as if he disappeared as mysteriously as he'd appeared, leaving behind only the recorded calls that had led us to 4 bodies that might otherwise never have been recovered. I've continued investigating cases throughout the Cascade Range, working with park rangers and federal agencies to solve crimes and locate missing persons in some of the most challenging terrain in the country. But I've never again received calls from someone with Eddie's impossible knowledge of wilderness deaths, never again encountered a witness who seemed to know about accidents before they were discovered by official search efforts. The recordings of Eddie's calls remain in our case files, documented evidence of tips that proved crucial to 4 separate death investigations. But the recordings also represent something we can't explain. A series of communications from someone who shouldn't have existed, providing information he shouldn't have possessed about deaths that occurred in locations where no witnesses should have been present. Sometimes I wonder if Eddie was some kind of guardian or observer, someone whose job was to ensure that people who died alone in the wilderness weren't left unfound and forgotten. Maybe he existed in the spaces between what we can document and what we can understand, serving a purpose that required knowledge we couldn't acquire through conventional investigation methods. The Cascade Range encompasses millions of acres of wilderness, where people occasionally disappear without explanation, where accidents occur far from any possibility of rescue, where bodies might remain undiscovered until they're reduced to scattered bone. If Eddie was watching over these places, ensuring that the dead were found and their families received closure, maybe his mysterious knowledge served a purpose more important than our need to understand how he acquired it. I still work cases involving wilderness deaths and missing persons, following established investigative procedures and coordinating with agencies that have the resources and expertise to conduct search operations in remote areas. But sometimes, when I'm reviewing reports of overdue hikers or unexplained disappearances, I find myself hoping that someone like Eddie is still watching, still calling when people die alone in places where their bodies might never be found. The mountains keep their secrets, but occasionally they allow voices to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Maybe that's enough. Maybe some witnesses exist beyond our ability to locate or question them, as long as they ensure that the dead are treated with dignity and their families receive the answers they need to find peace. I'm Karen Liu. I've been working as a Geographic Information Systems Specialist for the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department for 8 years, analyzing GPS data and creating digital maps for search and rescue operations. My job involves processing location data from emergency beacons, GPS devices, and cell phone tracking to help locate missing persons in some of the most challenging terrain in the Rocky Mountains. It's technical work that relies on precise measurements and established geographical principles until I analyzed the tracking data from Michael Rodriguez's GPS device in October of 2023. Michael was an experienced climber from Denver who had set out to attempt a solo ascent of Mount Elbert, Colorado's highest peak at 14,433 feet above sea level. He was well prepared for the climb, carrying professional-grade equipment, including a GPS tracking device that recorded his position every 30 seconds. The device was designed to allow family members to monitor his progress and to provide search teams with detailed location data if rescue became necessary. When Michael failed to return from his planned 2-day climb, his wife contacted our department to report him overdue. We immediately accessed the data from his GPS tracking device, expecting to find a trail that would lead us to his last known position and allow us to plan an efficient search operation. GPS tracking has revolutionized wilderness rescue, providing precise location data that can guide teams directly to missing persons within hours instead of days. The tracking data from Michael's device showed that he had begun his ascent at 6:47 a.m. on October 14th, following the standard East Ridge route up Mount Elbert. For the first 4 hours, his movement pattern was completely normal, steady progress up the established trail at a pace consistent with an experienced climber carrying a full pack. His elevation readings matched the known topography of the mountain, confirming that his GPS device was functioning correctly. But at 10:53 a.m., something changed in Michael's movement pattern. According to the GPS data, he had reached an elevation of approximately 13,000 feet and had left the established trail, beginning to ascend directly up the steep face of the mountain. This wasn't unusual by itself. Experienced climbers sometimes take alternative routes or explore off-trail areas, but Michael's rate of elevation gain became extraordinary. From 10:53 a.m. until 9:47 p.m., the GPS tracking showed Michael ascending continuously for 11 hours without any periods of rest or lateral movement. His elevation readings increased steadily throughout this period, rising from 13,000 feet to an impossible 14,837 feet. The final recorded elevation was 400 feet higher than Mount Elbert's actual summit. I initially assumed there was a malfunction in Michael's GPS device or an error in our data processing systems. GPS devices can occasionally produce inaccurate readings due to satellite interference, atmospheric conditions, or equipment failure. But when I verified the tracking data against multiple satellite systems and cross-referenced it with topographical surveys, the readings remained consistent across all sources. According to every available measurement system, Michael Rodriguez had somehow climbed to an elevation that didn't exist on Mount Elbert or any other mountain in Colorado. The GPS coordinates placed him 400 feet above the highest point of physical terrain in the area, suspended in midair above the actual summit of the mountain. I contacted the search and rescue coordinator to discuss the anomalous GPS data and request guidance on how to proceed with the search operation. The coordinator had over 20 years of experience with mountain rescues and had never encountered GPS readings that placed someone above a mountain's actual elevation. We agreed to dispatch search teams to both the established trail routes and the area where Michael's GPS indicated he had left the standard path. The search teams found Michael's body at the base of Mount Elbert's east face, approximately 7,000 feet below where his GPS device had recorded its final position. He had apparently died from injuries sustained in a fall, but the circumstances of his death raised immediate questions that we couldn't answer based on the physical evidence at the scene. Michael's body showed injuries consistent with a significant fall, but there was no obvious point of origin for such a fall. The area where he was found was directly below steep cliff faces, but those cliffs topped out at elevations well below where his GPS had tracked him during his final hours. If Michael had fallen from the elevations recorded by his GPS device, he would have fallen from empty air above the mountain's actual summit. More puzzling was the condition of Michael's climbing equipment. His ropes, hardware, and safety gear showed no signs of use during a fall or emergency situation. Professional climbers typically deploy safety equipment when they encounter difficulty. But Michael's gear was packed and unused, suggesting that whatever happened to him occurred without warning or opportunity to respond. The GPS device itself was recovered intact and showed no signs of damage or malfunction. When we downloaded the complete tracking data, it confirmed the impossible elevation readings and provided additional details that made Michael's final hours even more mysterious. The device had recorded continuous movement during the 11-hour ascent, with GPS coordinates that traced a steady path upward despite the absence of any physical terrain to support such movement. I consulted with GPS technology specialists, satellite tracking experts, and surveying professionals to understand how the device could have recorded impossible elevation data. Multiple experts examined the tracking information and confirmed that the GPS readings appeared technically accurate, with strong satellite signal strength and normal error margins throughout the recording period. One theory was that atmospheric conditions or satellite positioning errors had caused the GPS device to calculate incorrect elevations, while Michael was actually following normal climbing routes. But such errors would typically affect horizontal positioning as well as elevation, and Michael's horizontal coordinates remained consistent with the topography of Mount Elbert throughout his climb. Another possibility was that Michael had been climbing on structures or formations that weren't reflected in our topographical databases. Ice formations, snow cornices, or temporary features that could have provided purchase above the mountain's surveyed elevation. But October weather conditions hadn't produced significant ice or snow accumulation, and no other climbers had reported unusual formations on Mount Elbert. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Michael had died from multiple traumatic injuries consistent with a high-altitude fall, but couldn't determine the exact height or circumstances of the fall based on the physical evidence. The pattern of injuries suggested a significant vertical drop, but the location where his body was found didn't correspond to any cliff or drop-off that would produce such trauma. The official incident report classified Michael's death as an accidental fall during solo climbing, but noted the unexplained discrepancies in his GPS tracking data. The search and rescue coordinator filed my analysis of the elevation readings as supplementary information, but no formal conclusions were drawn about the cause of the GPS anomalies. Michael's family received the GPS tracking data as part of the official investigation materials, but I was reluctant to explain the full implications of what the device had recorded. How do you tell someone that their loved one apparently spent 11 hours climbing to elevations that don't exist, only to fall from empty air above a mountain summit? I've continued analyzing GPS data for search and rescue operations throughout Colorado, processing tracking information from hundreds of devices used by hikers, climbers, and outdoor enthusiasts. My analytical methods and equipment continue to produce reliable, accurate location data that supports successful rescue operations. But I've never again encountered GPS readings that placed someone at impossible elevations or coordinates that defied known topography. The tracking data from Michael's device remains archived in our digital storage systems, a detailed record of 11 hours of impossible movement that challenges basic assumptions about geography and GPS technology. Sometimes, when I'm calibrating equipment or training new technicians, I review Michael's tracking data as an example of the limitations and potential anomalies in GPS technology. But the data also serves as a reminder that there might be aspects of mountain environments that go beyond our current understanding of topography and elevation measurement. If Michael Rodriguez could somehow climb to elevations that didn't exist on any surveyed map, what other impossible movements might be occurring in wilderness areas where GPS tracking isn't available? The Rocky Mountains encompass millions of acres of terrain that has been mapped, surveyed, and measured with increasing precision over decades of technological advancement. We have detailed topographical data for every significant peak, ridge, and valley in the region. But Michael's GPS device recorded movement through elevations that don't appear on any map, suggesting that there might be dimensions or aspects of mountain geography that our measurement systems can't detect or document. Mountain climbing involves accepting calculated risks and understanding that the environment can change rapidly in ways that challenge even experienced climbers. Most accidents result from weather, equipment failure, or human error factors that can be analyzed and understood through established principles of physics and mountain safety. But Michael's case was different. His GPS device documented a climb that violated basic principles of geography and elevation measurement, tracking movement through space that shouldn't have been accessible to a human climber. The device recorded his final position as 400 feet above the highest point of solid ground, suspended in air above Mount Elbert's actual summit. I still work with GPS technology every day, analyzing location data and creating maps that guide search and rescue operations throughout Colorado. The technology continues to function reliably, providing accurate positioning information that saves lives and reunites families with missing loved ones. But sometimes, when I'm reviewing tracking data from remote mountain areas, I find myself wondering if other climbers might be accessing elevations that don't exist on our maps. The mountains keep their secrets, but occasionally they allow glimpses of possibilities that exist beyond our current understanding of physical geography. Michael Rodriguez climbed to an elevation that shouldn't have been possible, spent 11 hours ascending through space that didn't exist, and fell from a height that couldn't be measured. That's what his GPS device recorded, even though it doesn't make sense according to everything we know about mountains and gravity and the nature of physical space. Maybe that's enough. Maybe some climbs transcend the normal limitations of elevation and terrain, allowing people to reach heights that exist only temporarily, in dimensions that our mapping systems can't document. The GPS data remains as evidence of Michael's impossible final ascent, a digital record of 11 hours spent climbing towards something that couldn't be seen from the ground. I'm Dale Murphy. I've been working as an administrative assistant for Yellowstone National Park for 9 years, processing backcountry camping permits and maintaining records for thousands of wilderness visitors each season. My job involves reviewing permit applications, coordinating with rangers about campsite availability, and tracking visitor check-ins and check-outs to ensure everyone returns safely from their backcountry experiences. It's detail-oriented work that requires careful attention to documentation and procedures, until I processed a permit application in March of 2024 that described future events with impossible accuracy. The Hendricks family submitted their backcountry camping permit application on March 15th for a planned 4-day camping trip to the Shoshone Lake area. The family consisted of Robert and Marie Hendricks, both in their early 40s, and their twin daughters, Emma and Sarah, age 12. They were experienced campers from Montana who had visited Yellowstone multiple times and were familiar with backcountry regulations and safety requirements. What made their permit application notable was the level of detail in their campsite description and planned activities. Most permit applications include basic information about group size, planned dates, and general itinerary. But the Hendricks family had provided an unusually comprehensive description of their intended campsite setup, including specific details about tent placement, cooking area organization, and equipment storage that went well beyond what we typically require for permit approval. The application described their plan to set up camp at Site 12 on the north shore of Shoshone Lake, with their main tent positioned 15 feet from the water's edge and oriented to face southeast. They noted that they planned to establish their cooking area on higher ground about 20 yards from the tent, using rocks from the shoreline to create a windscreen around their camp stove. They also mentioned plans to store their food and scented items in bear canisters placed in a cluster of 3 large boulders, approximately 50 yards northwest of their tent. But what struck me as unusual was a section of the application where the family described anticipated weather conditions and contingency plans. They noted that they expected to encounter a severe thunderstorm on their third night and had planned accordingly by bringing additional rope to secure their tent and tarp to protect their gear. They described specific preparations for wind damage, including plans to move equipment away from trees that might fall during the storm. This level of weather planning was impressive but not unprecedented. Experienced campers often check detailed forecasts and prepare for various conditions. However, when I reviewed the extended weather forecast for the Shoshone Lake area, it showed clear skies and mild temperatures throughout the period covered by their permit. There was no indication of severe weather, thunderstorms, or high winds during their planned stay. I approved the Hendricks family's permit without any concerns. Their application demonstrated thorough preparation and familiarity with backcountry safety practices. They had reserved a legal campsite during an available period and had provided all required information about their planned activities. The detailed weather preparations seemed overly cautious but showed responsible camping practices. The family was scheduled to check out on March 19th, but they failed to appear at the designated checkout point. When campers don't check out on schedule, we initiate contact procedures to ensure they haven't encountered problems or decided to extend their stay. After 24 hours, with no response to our attempts to contact them, we dispatched rangers to their registered campsite to conduct a welfare check. Rangers Mike Torres and Jennifer Walsh hiked to Site 12 at Shoshone Lake on March 20th and found the Hendricks family's campsite exactly as described in their permit application. The tent was positioned 15 feet from the water's edge, facing southeast. The cooking area was established on higher ground 20 yards from the tent, with a windscreen made from shoreline rocks arranged around the camp stove. Bare canisters were stored in the cluster of boulders 50 yards northwest of the tent. But the campsite also showed extensive damage from what appeared to be a severe thunderstorm. The tent had been partially collapsed by falling tree branches, with several large limbs scattered around the site. The family's tarp had been deployed to protect equipment exactly as described in their application, but it was torn and damaged by wind and debris. Rope had been used to secure gear in multiple locations, with anchor points that matched the storm preparations they'd outlined in their permit. The rangers found no sign of the Hendricks family at the campsite or in the surrounding area. Their personal belongings were present and appeared undisturbed. Clothes, toiletries, books, and recreational equipment were all accounted for and properly stored. Their vehicle was still parked at the trailhead where they'd left it 4 days earlier, but there was no indication of where the family had gone or why they had left their campsite. What made the scene particularly puzzling was the evidence of severe weather damage at a location that hadn't experienced any storms during the time period covered by their permit. According to weather station data and reports from other campers in the area, March 16th through March 19th had been characterized by clear skies, mild temperatures, and light winds. No thunderstorms, high winds, or severe weather had occurred anywhere in the Shoshone Lake area during their planned stay. But on March 22nd, 3 days after the Hendricks family's scheduled checkout date, a severe thunderstorm system moved through the region and caused significant damage at backcountry campsites throughout the park. The storm brought high winds, heavy rain, and lightning that knocked down trees and damaged camping equipment at multiple locations, including Site 12 at Shoshone Lake. When rangers returned to the Hendricks campsite after the March 22nd storm, they found that the additional storm damage perfectly matched the existing damage they'd observed 2 days earlier. Trees that had been knocked down by the real storm fell in the same locations where branches had already been scattered around the abandoned campsite. Equipment that was damaged by the actual storm showed damage patterns identical to what had been present before the storm occurred. The search for the Hendricks family expanded to cover the entire Shoshone Lake area and adjacent watersheds. Teams of rangers, search and rescue volunteers, and trained dogs searched for any sign of the missing family over a period of 2 weeks. They found no tracks, no additional personal belongings, and no evidence that the family had ever left their registered campsite. The investigation revealed no obvious explanation for the family's disappearance, Their campsite showed no signs of struggle, animal interference, or emergency evacuation. Their gear was properly maintained and showed no evidence of equipment failure or safety problems. The family had been experienced campers with good judgment and appropriate preparation for their planned activities. But their permit application remained the most puzzling aspect of the case. The Hendricks family had described storm damage and weather preparations with accuracy that seemed to predict future weather events. They'd planned for a severe thunderstorm that didn't occur during their stay, but would occur 3 days after they disappeared, causing damage identical to what rangers found at their abandoned campsite. I've reviewed that permit application dozens of times, comparing every detail with the actual conditions found at Site 12. The family's description of tent placement, equipment organization, and storm preparations matched the physical evidence with precision that went beyond coincidence. They'd even accurately described the specific trees that would be damaged during the storm that happened after they vanished. The official incident report classified the Hendricks family as missing persons, with no evidence of foul play. The case remains open, but active search efforts were suspended after finding no viable leads or evidence about their whereabouts. Their permit application is part of the case file, but investigators focused on the physical evidence at the campsite rather than the impossible accuracy of their weather predictions. I've continued processing backcountry camping permits using the same procedures and forms I've used for years. Most applications are straightforward, basic information about planned activities, standard safety preparations, and general itineraries that reflect normal camping practices. I've never again received an application that described future events with the kind of detailed accuracy demonstrated by the Hendricks family. But I keep thinking about the level of preparation evident in their permit application and the impossible knowledge they seem to possess about weather conditions that wouldn't occur until after they disappeared. How does a family plan for storm damage 3 days before the storm happens? How do they describe equipment positioning and damage patterns with precision that matches future reality? Yellowstone's backcountry encompasses over 2 million acres of wilderness, where thousands of people camp every year. Most visitors have safe, enjoyable experiences that create lasting memories and strengthen their connection to the natural world. But occasionally, families disappear without explanation, leaving behind only questions and evidence that challenges our understanding of how time and knowledge work in the wilderness. The Hendricks family's permit application sits in our files as documentation of their planned camping trip, but it also serves as a record of impossible foreknowledge about events that hadn't yet occurred. They described their campsite with accuracy that extended beyond their stay into a future they wouldn't be present to experience. Sometimes I wonder if some permit applications document more than planned activities, if they might occasionally record glimpses of events that exist outside normal temporal boundaries. Maybe experienced campers sometimes sense aspects of their wilderness experiences that go beyond what weather forecasts and trip planning can predict. The Shoshone Lake area continues to host backcountry campers throughout the summer season, and Site 12 remains available for reservation by families who want to experience the beauty and solitude of Yellowstone's wilderness. The campsite shows no lasting evidence of the storm damage documented in the Hendricks family's permit application, or the actual storms that followed their disappearance. But their permit application remains as evidence that some camping plans might extend beyond the normal boundaries of time and preparation, documenting experiences that include knowledge of events that haven't yet occurred. Maybe that's sufficient. Maybe some families possess insights about their wilderness experiences that exceed our current understanding of trip planning and weather prediction, even if those insights can't prevent the mysteries that sometimes unfold in places where time moves differently than we expect. I'm Rob Santos. I've been working as a field technician for the Great Basin National Park for 6 years, maintaining the network of wildlife cameras we use to monitor animal populations and behavior patterns throughout the park. My job involves hiking to remote camera locations every few months to replace memory cards, check battery levels, and ensure the equipment is functioning properly. It's solitary work that takes me to some of the most isolated areas in Nevada, but I've always found it peaceful and predictable until I reviewed the footage from Camera Station 47 in November of 2023. Camera Station 47 is located in a remote section of the Snake Range, about 12 miles from the nearest road, and accessible only by a challenging day hike through difficult terrain. The camera monitors a natural water source that attracts wildlife from across a wide area, making it one of our most productive monitoring locations. Due to its remote position and the technical difficulty of reaching it, the camera is serviced only twice per year, typically in late spring and early fall. I had scheduled maintenance for Camera 47 on November 8, 2023. The hike took me most of the morning, climbing through steep terrain and navigating rocky sections that required careful attention to avoid injury. When I reached the camera location around noon, everything appeared normal. The camera was properly mounted, the protective housing was intact, and the LED indicators showed the unit was functioning correctly. Following standard procedure, I downloaded the contents of the memory card before replacing it with a fresh card and new batteries. The camera had been recording continuously for approximately 6 months since my previous maintenance visit in May, so I expected the memory card to contain thousands of images documenting wildlife activity throughout the summer and early fall seasons. Back at the office, I began reviewing the downloaded images to identify and catalog wildlife sightings for our research database. Most wildlife cameras capture primarily routine animal behavior: deer drinking at water sources, birds visiting during different times of day, occasional larger mammals like elk or mountain lions. The process of reviewing camera footage is methodical, but often reveals interesting insights about animal behavior and population dynamics. About halfway through the 6 months of recorded images, I found something that made me stop and review the camera's timestamp settings. The image was dated August 14th, 2023, and showed a person performing maintenance on the camera. But according to my work schedule and maintenance logs, no one from our department had visited Camera 47 between my May visit and the November visit I'd just completed. The person in the image was clearly conducting routine maintenance, replacing the memory card, checking battery connections, and cleaning the camera lens. They were wearing standard fieldwork clothing and carrying equipment that matched our department's standard maintenance kit. But what made the image immediately unsettling was that the person performing the maintenance was me. I stared at the image for several minutes, thinking there had to be an error in the camera's timestamp or some other technical explanation. But the more I examined the footage, the more certain I became that I was looking at myself conducting maintenance at Camera 47 on a date when I had documented proof that I was 200 miles away. August 14th had been during my annual vacation, which I'd spent visiting family in Sacramento, California. I had airline tickets, hotel receipts, and dozens of photographs documenting my presence in California throughout that week. There was absolutely no possibility that I had been at Camera 47 on August 14th, yet the wildlife camera had recorded clear images of me performing routine maintenance exactly as I would have done during a scheduled visit. But the person in the camera footage was wearing clothes I didn't recognize. The shirt was similar to ones I owned, but in a color I'd never purchased. The hiking boots appeared to be the same brand and style I wore for fieldwork, but they looked newer than any boots I currently own. Even the maintenance kit being used in the footage contained tools that were identical to mine, but appeared to be in better condition. I reviewed the timestamp data multiple times to ensure there was no error in the camera's internal clock or date settings. The timestamp was accurate according to all available verification methods. The camera had recorded me performing maintenance on August 14th at 2:37 in the afternoon, during a week when I could prove I was in California visiting family. The maintenance being performed in the footage was technically perfect, following exactly the procedures I would use during a real visit to Camera 47. The person who appeared to be me replaced the memory card with practiced efficiency, checked all the camera's connections, cleaned the lens housing, and tested the motion sensor trigger. Everything about the maintenance procedure was professionally executed and identical to my standard protocols. I consulted our equipment logs to determine if any other staff members had been assigned to Camera 47 during August. But Camera 47 was exclusively my responsibility, and no one else in our department was scheduled or authorized to service that location. The camera's remote position and difficult access route made it impractical for anyone other than the assigned technician to perform maintenance there. More puzzling was the question of how someone could have obtained the exact equipment, clothing, and technical knowledge necessary to perform maintenance that matched my procedures with such precision. Our department's maintenance protocols are specific to our equipment and developed through years of field experience. An outsider would need detailed technical knowledge and specialized tools to service the cameras correctly. I showed the footage to my supervisor, Dave Martinez, who had worked with our wildlife camera program for over 10 years. Dave reviewed the images carefully and agreed that the person performing maintenance appeared to be me, but he was equally puzzled by the impossible timing. He suggested that someone might have been impersonating me for unknown reasons, though that didn't explain how they'd acquired such detailed knowledge of our maintenance procedures. We decided to examine the camera footage more carefully to look for any clues about the identity of the person performing the unauthorized maintenance. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed more details that made the situation even more unsettling. The person's movements, posture, and technical approach were identical to my own work habits. Even minor details, like the order in which I typically check equipment and the way I handle delicate electronic components, were replicated perfectly. The facial features visible in the footage were unmistakably mine, despite the image quality limitations of wildlife camera technology. The person had my height, build, and general appearance, along with mannerisms that I recognized as my own. If not for the documented impossibility of my presence at Camera 47 on August 14th, I would have assumed I was looking at routine footage from one of my scheduled maintenance visits. Dave and I reviewed our security protocols and considered whether the footage might indicate some kind of security breach or unauthorized access to our monitoring equipment. But Camera 47's remote location made it unlikely that casual trespassers would attempt to reach it, and the technical knowledge demonstrated in the footage suggested someone with professional training in wildlife camera maintenance. The incident was reported to Park Administration as a potential security concern, but the investigation found no evidence of unauthorized personnel accessing our camera network or compromising our equipment. The maintenance performed in the August footage had been technically correct and hadn't interfered with the camera's operation or data collection. From an administrative perspective, no damage had been done and no policies had been violated. But the personal implications of seeing myself perform work I hadn't done, at a time when I was documented to be elsewhere, continued to disturb me. I'd worked alone in remote areas for years and had never experienced anything that challenged my understanding of my own activities and whereabouts. The footage represented a version of myself performing familiar work in a familiar location, but a version that couldn't logically exist. I've continued maintaining Camera 47 on its regular schedule, hiking to the remote location twice yearly to service the equipment and download recorded data. The camera has never again recorded footage of unauthorized maintenance or shown any signs of tampering or interference. It continues to function normally, documenting wildlife activity according to our research protocols. But I've kept copies of the August footage in my personal files, reviewing it occasionally to see if I can identify any details that might explain how someone could have replicated my appearance and procedures with such accuracy. The more I examine the images, the more convinced I become that I'm looking at myself, despite the logical impossibility of my presence at that location on that date. The Great Basin encompasses millions of acres of remote wilderness where individual technicians work alone for hours or days without contact with other people. Our wildlife camera network provides valuable data about animal behavior and population dynamics, but it also creates a record of human activity in areas where few people venture. If camera 47 recorded impossible footage of me performing work I didn't do, what other impossible activities might be documented by cameras in locations I haven't visited? Sometimes I wonder if the isolation and repetitive nature of wilderness work might create conditions where reality becomes more flexible than we normally expect. Maybe some locations exist in states that allow different versions of events to occur simultaneously, or different versions of people to perform the same tasks in overlapping time frames that don't follow normal rules about cause and effect. The maintenance procedures I use at Camera 47 are routine and methodical, developed through years of experience and adapted to the specific challenges of working in remote locations. But seeing myself perform those same procedures during a time when I was hundreds of miles away suggests that some aspects of my work might transcend the normal limitations of time and location, creating versions of maintenance activities that exist independently of my conscious awareness or physical presence. Maybe that's sufficient. Maybe some jobs in remote wilderness areas create echoes or impressions that persist beyond the actual work being performed, allowing cameras to record activities that exist in dimensions parallel to, but separate from, normal work schedules and geographical boundaries. The August footage remains as evidence that I performed maintenance at Camera 47 during a week when I was absent from Nevada, documenting work that was technically perfect, but temporally impossible. The wildlife cameras continue to record whatever moves within their detection range, capturing images of animals, weather patterns, and occasional human activity in some of the most remote locations in the park. Most of the footage is routine and predictable, providing valuable data for our research programs. But sometimes, the cameras document activities that challenge our understanding of who performs work in the wilderness and whether all maintenance tasks occur within the timeframes and locations where we expect them to happen.